If you're going to dominate and do things that others consider impossible, you're going to have to become capable of what others aren't, namely discipline. You will have to relentlessly cut things out of your life. For every one person that manages to generate success while regularly drinking alcohol, smoking weed, stuffing their face full of sugar, there's 100,000 people that become too inefficient to succeed. Today, human optimization expert Gary Brecka and I discuss the one true path to winning. Gary Brecka, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, man.
It's great to have you. So basically everybody has some kind of addiction, whether it's alcohol, sugar, social media, weed, any number of things.
Right.
And even if it's not bad enough to require you to go to rehab, it is going to be bad enough to slow you down such that you're stuck in a pattern of mediocrity. Assuming that you agree with that.
I do agree with that. That's it. It's the first time I've ever heard somebody say that everyone has some form of addiction, but I agree with you. Probably not for the reason you think, but I do agree with you.
All right. Give people your most compelling argument as to why those things are probably worse than they think.
Well, because, we used to say in the mortality space, and I was a mortality researcher for 22 years, that the absence of dopamine is the presence of addiction. And if you look, for example, at sugar addiction, most people are not liking the taste of sugar. Yes, we like the sweet taste of sugar. The truth is most of us don't like sugar. We're addicted to sugar. And why is that? Because when we eat sweets, we actually get a dopamine reward, right? We get an actual little endorphin reward. If you look at the most addiction, the history of most addiction, if you've ever been an addict or you've known a true addict, addiction has a tendency to shift and not really ever go away. Alcoholics become drug addicts become workoutaholics become workaholics become gamblers. So why does addiction have a tendency to shift? Because you can cure the physical addiction, but the dopamine deficiency drives the behavior. Like serotonin is one of the main drivers of mood, dopamine is one of the main drivers of behavior. That's why I often say, you show me a child that can play video games for 14 hours a day, I'll show you a future addict. Right? They're generally not playing the video game because they like the video game. They're playing the video game because it makes them feel normal. In fact, most addiction does not begin with the search for getting banged up. Most addicts didn't wake up one day and go, I want to get really banged up. They woke up one day and said, I want to feel normal. And it was a search for normalcy that led to an addiction. And then once they had a physical addiction, now they're running from a low. They're not running towards a high. Right? If you talk to a true alcoholic, a true drug addict, very often that habit is continuing because they do not want to go off that cavernous hole that's right behind them. And it's not that they are any longer chasing that high. So I do agree with you. A lot of people have a dopamine deficiency, which drives different types of addictive behavior. And we have addictive behaviors that we would consider healthy addictions, right? I mean, when I was a triathlete, I was never a professional triathlete, but I was a very competitive amateur triathlete. I would say that 35 or 40% of the guys that I raced with were recovering addicts of one form or another. So this was their new addiction. Centuries, 100-mile bike rides, 2.5-mile swims, 13-mile runs. This was their new addiction, and they were psycho committed to it.
I know there's people that are going to listen to this and they will not like the fact that I use the word addiction. Mm-hmm. The reason that I use that is I think that there are things that we do habitually. Mm-hmm. So from the classic definition of an addict, of somebody who will do something even in the face of it absolutely destroying their lives, right. I think that for the people that watch this show, there's probably a higher likelihood that they have a different avenue of thing that is softening the quality of their life. And those are the things that I want to call out and see map sort of your thinking around this. So when I think about alcohol use, there's a lot of people that they can do it without it being addictive. Like I don't have an addictive personality,
right?
But when I go in on something, I go way in on that thing. And so I know people will go through a party phase. So I'm always, when people come to me and say, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur, I'm like, amazing. If you really want that, though, you're going to have to sell your 20s. Mm-hmm. So most people are going to sell their 20s to partying. Mm-hmm. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you're going to have to, quote unquote, sell your 20s to that. So you're going to have to be in skill acquisition going hard.
Okay.
And so if you've got somebody that comes home every day and they're smoking weed, they're going out, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, drinking, I have no moral problem with that whatsoever. But in terms of if you want to do something extraordinary with your life, those two things are incompatible.
Well, I totally agree with you. I mean, the passion has got to be greater than the problem, right? So if that's the problem, your passion has to just far outweigh. I mean, that's not even in consideration any longer, right? I mean, I feel extraordinarily blessed because I feel like through God's grace, one way or another, I found a career that I would otherwise do for free and somehow monetized it. So it never feels like work to me. Like this doesn't feel like work to me right now. I'm pumped to be here. I'm excited about this conversation. When this is over, I can't wait to get to the next meeting, the next conversation, the next client to talk about the next issue because I'm just almost possessed by it. And when I'm done, the end of the day, I'll spend 2 or 3 hours reading peer-reviewed science or looking at a journal article or watching a podcast on, one of my mentors to try to further educate myself. Like I can't get enough of it. And I think a lot of times that, when people say, I want to be an entrepreneur, I think they really want to be rich. It's not that they really want to be an entrepreneur. Because it took me 45 years to figure that out. I spent, the better part of my life until my early 40s being very inauthentic and really desperately wanting to be wealthy. And I was very good at what I did. I was a mortality expert in the insurance industry, but I was spending my entire time predicting how soon people were going to die, and predicting death to the month and allowing myself to believe that that this was just data and I couldn't have any effect on it. And these were just numbers and this was just a spreadsheet and I didn't cause it and it wasn't my responsibility to get people out of this. It was just my responsibility to crunch the data. And really kind of all I cared about at the time was I just so desperately wanted to be wealthy. And I had a major capitulation in my life, when I realized that there were human beings on the other side of these spreadsheets and that this wasn't just data. And when I left that industry and started focusing on people's well-being and stopped focusing on becoming wealthy, I became wealthy. And now my focus isn't on wealth, it's on well-being. And the wealth just seems to keep coming. And so I think it's an interesting way that the universe works.
So as somebody that has literally switched the direction of your life to help people with their well-being, what is it about some of the most common vices like drinking or weed smoking or whatever that have become really just, you get a pass in culture if you do those things, or even some of it, quite frankly, is encouraged. What is it about those things that's going to damage somebody's, whether it's mental fitness, as you call it, or just metabolic health? You've talked a lot about oxygen transportation and mitochondria. Like, are the vices that really mess people up, are they things that mess with oxygen transportation? Like what, or do you think that that's not true and people can drink and stay up late and do recreational drugs? I'm not talking about somebody who's like shooting heroin.
Yeah.
But I'm saying the ones that like culturally people are like, yeah, no, there's no big deal. Do you think they are a big deal?
Well, number one, I think they're a big deal. And I think they're a big deal because your purpose isn't big enough, right? Because if the purpose is big enough, then that stuff pales so far in comparison that, like anything that would take me off my game even momentarily. And I think you get a pass in society for it, sure. But if we go really to the root cause of this or the root drivers of this, like if you said to me, Gary, what is a mood? What is an emotional state? Like, what is it? What's happiness? What's elation, passion, joy, arousal? What is libido? I mean, what actually are they in the human body? Well, they're collections of neurotransmitters, right? Like a recipe. Bound to oxygen, at least the elevated emotional states are. So if you think about, for example, all of the elevated emotional states, passion, elation, joy, arousal, libido, kind of all the hell yeah, I won the lottery emotions. They all have one thing in common. They have oxygen as a part of their molecular structure. All right, this is why nobody has ever woken up laughing. Right? You haven't woken, no human being has ever woken out of a deep sleep laughing. Why? Because you don't have the oxidative state to experience laughter. But can you wake up angry? Sure. I mean, if you want to do a really cool experiment tonight, just pinch your spouse while she's in a deep sleep.
It sounds like a very bad idea, Gary.
Yeah, no, I said you do the experiment, not me. That's why I'm using you as the guinea pig, Tom. And why is it? That's because anger and despair and jealousy and resentment, these are very low, not only are they low frequency emotions, but they're low oxidative emotions, right? So they don't require an elevated oxidative state. And so very often what happens is people have a hard time maintaining elevated emotional states. So they reach elevated emotional states like a heart monitor, right? Not like rolling hills where they can stay in an elevated mood for a prolonged period of time, but they reach it like a heart monitor and they fall. And why is that? It's because their physiology drags them into the state where it most comfortably exists. So now it is harder to push yourself into these emotional states. One of the ways to get there is drugs and alcohol. One of the ways to get there is like promiscuity or like dramatic activity, right? Shocking activity that actually gets you into that emotional state. You try to hold on to it and it falls. And this is why lots of people will spend a lifetime doing the right things, like trying to journal, pray. They develop a morning routine. They try to focus on positive thinking. They go to the right seminars. They try to put themselves in the right rooms. And they can't seem to maintain that elevated emotional state. It's because their physiology is dragging them back down into the state where you most comfortably exist. And so now if we talk about, well, what are some of these recipes? Like, well, what is happiness? And this is an exact recipe, but let's say happiness is so much norepinephrine, so much epinephrine, so much dopamine, so much serotonin, boom, you have the emotion happiness. Okay, well, what if you have an issue in the gut? Just methylating one of those neurotransmitters, right? So take serotonin, for example. 90% of the serotonin in our bodies is right here.
So crazy.
If you don't have it here, you can't have it here. So very often, the absence of certain emotional states doesn't begin in the outside environment. Like anxiety rarely begins in your outside environment. It almost always begins with your physiology, and you can prove this. So let's say, for example, that you're having a difficult time methylating serotonin. What does that mean? It means turning an amino acid called tryptophan into the neurotransmitter serotonin. Or dopamine, the main driver of behavior, turning phenylalanine and tyrosine into the neurotransmitter dopamine. Well, you don't have a mood disorder. You don't have a mental illness. You are missing a raw material that's required to assemble certain emotional states. It's just like going to a bakery chef and saying, listen, you could bake whatever you want. You just can't use butter. Okay, well, it doesn't sound like a big deal, right? It's only one ingredient. But if you think of the number of recipes that would affect, cookies, pastries, pies, brownies, what have you, just by removing that one ingredient, it's no different than going to a human being and saying you can be in whatever emotional state you want. You just can't use serotonin. Okay, well, that just wiped out a whole tier of emotion. And that's why, part of my message is about physiology and diet and what we can do to naturally restore proper methylation of neurotransmitters, the creation of these neurotransmitters so they are readily available for us to assemble mood. So we don't have deficits that cause us to seek the types of behaviors that short-term spike those moods.
Dude, I love that. I have said many, many, many times on this show that I want my tombstone
Maybe I got it
to
from
read.
You.
No, I didn't say that. What I've said many, many times is on my tombstone, I wanted to say you're having a biological experience. And the reason that I bring this whole thing up is that I think people fail to understand that they're having a biological experience, that they're going to experience their entire life through the lens of how they're maintaining their biology. And I'll call it a vice, but I don't even think of it like that. Anything that you're doing, whether it's just for fun, you're going out to hang out with your friends, you're having drinks because drinking makes me feel like I'm suppressing the urge to dance on a table. It feels awesome. It is a wonderful feeling. And if it didn't have negative consequences to me from a longevity perspective, from an ability to think clearly perspective, I would do it a lot. I have no moral problem with it whatsoever.
Right.
But you're having a biological experience. And once people understand that life is you trying to modulate your brain states, that's it. You're playing with your emotions. Why do you go watch a movie? Because it plays with your emotions in a way that we find pleasurable. Why do you play a video game? Because it plays with your neurological state. Dude, I have seen videos of a moose getting drunk on fermented apples that have fallen off the tree or whatever they were. It is just hardwired in animals to modulate their own neurochemistry. This is exactly why we do drugs, why I say that people have addictions, even though most people will not think of them as addictions. You're trying to fiddle with the knobs on your brain. That's what this game is. And so I'm saying, hey, you're going to fiddle with your knobs. We all are. Be very careful that the knobs that you're fiddling with do not create a state where either you're constantly chasing something because you don't feel good, right? So you have low energy and you're chasing just feeling normal, or you are getting to the point where you have brain fog and you can't think clearly because you've gone out and you've partied and you don't realize how long that takes to really get out of your system.
Right.
I mean, just on and on and on, people are doing things. My own battle with anxiety, this is one of the things that made me so eager to have you on the show. I am utterly convinced that not the sum total, but the vast majority of my anxiety is diet related.
Oh my gosh, I could
every time
totally
I figure
agree
out
with
a
you.
piece of that puzzle, I'm like, oh, my anxiety now has gotten less. And so getting people to understand the things you do are going to matter a lot. And if you're watching this channel, the odds are that you're trying to do something extraordinary in your life. And I'm telling you right now, as much as, dude, if you've never smoked weed and had sex, it is a different sport. It is amazing. I love it the most.
Yeah.
But because it has I get this is going to be very controversial. For me, if I try to do it frequently, I'm so lethargic is probably the right word. I just don't feel sharp. And if you are not at the razor's edge of your abilities, you will never be able to do anything extraordinary. And you're not going to be at the razor's edge of your ability unless you're doing all kinds of things to optimize your physiology.
Couldn't agree with you more. In fact, when you look at anxiety, for example, when you ask most people what anxiety is, they describe the emotional state of anxiety, right? A fear of the future, a fear of anxiousness, or they describe situations that they're in that actually can generate these fears, right? And true situational anxiety does exist. But if you want to prove that anxiety is coming from your physiology and not from your outside emotion, you got to ask yourself these 3 questions, or ask somebody that you know that's suffering from anxiety these 3 questions. And what you'll find is that it's actually not coming from their outside environment, what we usually call a cluster of symptoms. It's coming from their physiology. And if you don't address the physiological root, then all you're left with are coping mechanisms, right? And the majority of what's available to people with anxiety are coping mechanisms, right? Diazepam, zolpidem nitrate, Valium, Xanax, therapy, counseling, which I am not poo-pooing by any stretch. I think people that get counseling or therapy, actually, it's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. But what I'm saying is, rather than learn to cope with what you have, why don't you dig in and get rid of it? Because if you take another layer deeper and you say, okay, have I had anxiety on and off throughout my entire lifetime? You ask most people that suffer from true anxiety, they'll say, yes. I've had it in one form or fashion on and off throughout my entire lifetime. There's your first signs coming from your physiology, very likely coming from a gene mutation called MTHFR, which between 44 and 60% of the population has, which is directly why I agree with you that diet has a massive impact on anxiety, because methylfolate has a massive impact on anxiety. And if you ask them a second question, can you point to the specific trigger that causes it? I mean, every time you start to feel anxiety, can you point to the specific trigger that causes it? The majority of the time they'll say no. And the third question is, well, if you've ever tried anti-anxiety medications, have they worked? And most of the time they'll say, no, it just makes me feel like a zombie. There's a dead indication that is coming from your physiology. So now if we take it another step deeper and we say, well, then what is it in my physiology that is causing me to feel this way? Well, there's a category of neurotransmitters in your brain and other areas of your body, and that's called catecholamines. And catecholamines are fight or flight neurotransmitters, right? Norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, ephedrine, which we also call adrenaline. So these are fight or flight neurotransmitters. And understand that the brain, as sophisticated as we'd like to think it is, it's actually not. The brain is actually very primal. What the brain cares about is the brain cares about survival. And so if you, for example, drove home tonight and you got out of your car and somebody was standing in front of you with a knife, okay, that's a very real fear. Your pupils would dilate, your heart rate would increase, your extremities would flood with blood. You would start having a fight or flight response, which is a flood of catecholamines into the brain. And this could save your life, right? You're instantly prepared to fight or flight. Your field of vision widens. Your hearing gets more acute, which is why people that suffer from anxiety also don't like a lot of bright lights. They usually don't like loud music. They don't like a lot of stuff going on, a lot of sensory input, right? Because catecholamines heighten that awareness state. You can actually pick these catecholamines up in the urine of people that are having anxiety. Urinary catecholamines are directly related to the state of anxiety. So first of all, we know that catecholamines are released into the brain, but what if I wasn't driving home and getting out of my car and having somebody stand in front of me with a knife? What if I was just laying in my bed here in Los Angeles? And we're pretty far up the hill here. It's pretty nasty, windy drive getting here. And you started thinking about getting eaten by a shark. So you're laying in your bed here at the top of this hill, and you start thinking about getting eaten by a shark. The chances of a shark getting out of that Pacific Ocean and making it up that, even if it got an Uber, making it up that road into your bed and biting you are zero.
Have you not seen Sharknado, Gary?
Can
we really say it's zero?
Is it? I said are almost zero.
I'll grant you.
Because you never know that, maybe the sharks in out in California can call an Uber. I don't know. Shark Cooper. Oh God, no. Let's not try comedy on here. I'll stick to science. My point is that you're in a very real, visceral, threatening situation. Somebody in front of you with a knife, and you're in an entirely perceived, imagined situation, laying in your bed thinking about getting eaten by a shark. But you can have the exact same response. Pupils dilate, heart rate increases, extremities flood with blood, hearing gets more acute, pupillary vision dilates. You can have the exact same response. And why is that? Because this same physiologic route, a dump of catecholamines into the brain. So if we even take it a step further and we say, well, are there people that have impaired catecholamine regulation, that have an impaired ability to downregulate catecholamines? Yes. About 35% of the population has a genetic mutation called COMT, C-O-M-T, catechol-O-methyltransferase. If you have this gene mutation, it's possible that you have very slow breakdown of catecholamines, which means that these fight or flight neurotransmitters can rise in your brain very slowly, but eventually they trigger a state of anxiety. You're not actually fearing, you're not having a feeling of anxiety, you're having a feeling of heightened catecholamines in the brain.
Trust me, cold plunging is amazing. It is all it is hyped up to be. Lisa and I both do this all the time. And if you have one of the beautiful tubs from Plunge, you really can train your mind while you train your body to adapt to uncomfortable situations with every plunge. Get in the cold water, center yourself, get focused. It is amazing the way that it will toughen your mind. And the great news is the sleek ones from Plunge have amazing tech that makes it super fast and easy to set up. You can use them indoors or outdoors with no plumbing required. Build your resilience, get tough, and be able to tackle difficult problems. Just go to plunge.com and use the code IMPACT to get $150 off your incredible cold plunge tub today. Again, that's code IMPACT for $150 off your purchase at plunge.com, or you can find the link in the show notes.
And the same thing happens when these people lay down to go to sleep at night, right? People that suffer from this type of gene mutation will lay down and go to bed at night, and as their environment quiets, their mind will wake up. And they'll tell you, I'm body tired, but I'm mind awake. I just lay there and I think about the most innocuous little thoughts, like nothing that couldn't wait till the next day. Right? They're like, did I get everything on my grocery list? Did my belt match my shoes? Did I return that email? Sometimes they'll just wonder, if I had a Thanksgiving Day party, what color dishes would I use? And then they can catch themselves and go, what the hell am I thinking about Thanksgiving Day dishes for? It's 2:00 in the morning. Because your mind is awake. Your body's tired, your mind is awake. So what if you could restore, and you can through proper supplementation, which also comes from proper diet. So what downregulates catecholamines? Things like the proper B vitamin balance, methylfolate, a complex of B vitamins, specifically the types of B vitamins that are found naturally in nature, like hydroxycobalamin, methylcobalamin, and adenosylcobalamin. Those things that are found in green leafy vegetables, grass-fed meats, eggs, and cruciferous vegetables. Those have high amounts of folate, B vitamins, very bioavailable forms, and so now the body has the raw material to break down catecholamines, which is why diet can affect the incidence of anxiety. It's why some people can take certain methylated vitamins and their anxiety goes into permanent or semi-permanent remission. They go, holy shit, I didn't think it could be that easy. It is, if you understand human physiology.
Okay, so I have a hypothesis that there is a relatively small basket of things that people do on a pretty regular basis that cause maximum damage. I'll give you a couple examples and then give me your basket. So if you let me pull a few levers in somebody's life, I think I can change it forever and for the better. I'm going to control their sleep. I'm going to control their access to the sun. And if I'm going to stop at 3, I would control their sugar intake. Their blood glucose levels is actually what I would steer by.
Yeah.
There's a few more that are pretty high impact, but I'll stop there. What do you agree that there is in terms of common, that there's a relatively small basket? And if so, what's in the basket?
I would absolutely believe those 3 are certainly in the top 5. I might add 2 more, but yes. What's interesting, I was just talking to my wife about this. As I sort of travel around the world and I meet with, some of the world's leading anti-aging, longevity, biohacking experts, I mean, a lot of these researchers that are doing fascinating things in gene therapy. I go to a lot of retreats and events. What's really astounding, Tom, is that the science of biooptimization is coming full circle, meaning we're just getting back to the basics, which is exactly what you're saying. Forget the fancy, equipment. Forget this rare Amazon root that this company has that's patented and licensed and trademarked, and it, they skin it and boil it and dry it, and this is the secret elixir to life. It's back to the basics. The further we get away from the basics, the sicker we become.
Can you break out what are the basics?
So the basics are what we get from Mother Nature, which are 3 things. We get light from the sun. So I'm completely with you on light. We get oxygen from the air. Most of us are not breathing properly anymore. Sedentary lifestyle is the leading cause of all-cause mortality. We're not moving. We're not getting enough oxygen into our bodies, which is why I'm a huge fan of breath work in the morning. And we're not touching the surface of the earth. Earthing.
The whole time I've been researching you, I'm like, Jesus, I never, and I mean never, am barefoot unless I'm on vacation, which is like once a year.
Bro, you need to get a PEMF mat.
Yeah.
Or start touching the surface of the earth.
That's too far away.
It's right outside your door.
Not really. Will my driveway count? My driveway is artificial grass and cement.
You don't have any grass on the side.
We have like one little patch. I wondered if that would count.
Yeah.
Because
you don't need to move. Just touch.
But how deep does that have to be? Like, I'm sure it's sitting over tanks and things like that, so it's not
probably
be super deep.
Look, you can get a Gauss meter and check it, but most soil, dirt, grass, sand is perfect. If not, when people are like, oh, I don't want to buy all this fancy equipment. There's no fancy equipment you have to buy if you can touch the surface of the earth. If for whatever reason you can't touch the surface of the earth, then invest in something like a PEMF mat, pulse electromagnetic field, that puts low Gauss current through the body and mimics the magnetic field of the earth. So those are some of the basics. Sunlight, breathing oxygen, and contacting the surface of the earth. And I am absolutely with you. The third or fourth would be glycemic control, blood sugar control. Sugar is the root of all evil. The Bible should say sugar is the root of all evil, not the love of money, right? Because I don't think people are dying because they love money, but they are dying from blood sugar. And in my entire...
Is it just that they're overeating? Sugar makes them overeat, and that's the problem?
No.
Or sugar itself, even in small quantities, is going to be problematic?
It's the fact that sugar is hidden in everything now. Our sugar consumption since 1964 has gone up 400-fold. Not 400, it's gone up because it's in everything. And then we had a massive war in the 90s on fat, which was like the worst thing to ever happen to the food pyramid, was to have this massive war on fats in general, and saturated fats and natural oils. And we started to replace everything with processed foods and sugars, which really spike your insulin. And we know now, for example, that a lot of mental and psychiatric illness has its root in blood sugar. For example, we know now that Alzheimer's disease is type 3 diabetes. It's insulin resistance in the brain, right? I mean, the brain is so crack addicted to sugar that it secretes its own insulin, right? Most even physicians think, no, the pancreas is the only place that beta cells, the islets in the pancreas is the only place that insulin's made. That's not true. The brain makes its own insulin. It is crack addicted to sugar. And when the brain wants sugar, the brain gets sugar, right? The brain's nasty. It's like a little Kim Jong-un of dictators. It just sits up there and it takes everything for itself. If it wants calcium, it'll leach it from the bones. If it wants amino acids, it'll strip it from lean muscle. And if it wants sugar, it'll activate a receptor on the back of the tongue called the RF1A2 receptor, which also provides a dopamine ding for giving it sugar. But the trick is you have to swallow, right? So in order, we swallow these sweet products and it gives us a dopamine reward. In fact, if you look at the genesis of most artificial sweeteners, only a fraction of the chemical sweetener is actually designed to meet the taste of the sweetener. The entirety of the rest of those chemicals are designed to ding their dopamine receptor.
Whoa.
Which is why artificial sweeteners are so addictive. It's why you know people that drink 12, I'm not saying you know, but most of us know somebody that'll drink like 6, 8, 10 Diet Cokes in a day.
Bro, I used to drink 3 full-sized cans of Monster, zero calorie, but
Right.
artificial sweeteners out the ass, plus 1 to 3 Diet Cokes. And that was obviously peak anxiety. I didn't yet understand that diet could play a role in that. The bad news is I got lean as hell. It was awesome, and it was how I managed my hunger. And P.S., they taste amazing.
Yeah.
But this is my whole thesis, is that you're getting one thing out of all these things you do that damage your physiology. But if you understand that there's like a trade-off, like Monday through Friday, I don't allow myself to drink Diet Coke. On Saturday, I'll have half a Diet Coke, and on Sunday, I'll have half a Diet Coke. Not because I think it's good for me, because I think it tastes good.
Right.
But because I understand that there's a knock-on effect of everything I put in my mouth or don't put in my mouth or on my skin or, on and on, you start to do a different calculus. And
I agree.
It's that calculus that I think is so important to understand if you're trying to really optimize.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. And the truth is that most of us are walking around at about 50 or 60% of our true state of normal. And we are very likely just a few nutrients away from being completely optimal. But we just don't know what those nutrients are. You want to talk about magic things happening in the human body. Magic happens in the human body when you give it the raw material it needs to do its job. And if we start with the understanding, the very truthful understanding, that there's not a single compound known to mankind, not one. There's no vitamin, no mineral, no amino acid, no protein, no carbohydrate of any kind that we put into the human body and that's used in the format that we put it in. Without a single exception, everything that enters our body has to be refined into the usable form. It goes
Even salt?
Even salt, yeah. Sodium chloride, NaCl, is not used in the sodium chloride form. It's actually broken. That molecule is broken down and put into different physiologic reactions. If you look at the way the mitochondria uses water, for example, it breaks off the hydrogens and it breaks off the oxygen. The oxygen goes into one side of the Krebs cycle. The hydrogens bind to NAD plus and reduce it to NADH, and then it enters the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. So everything that enters our body, you eat a piece of chicken, the chicken is useless until it's broken down into amino acids. You ingest folate or folic acid, it's useless until your body turns it into methylfolate. This process in human beings is called methylation. We do
the
it
process of turning something into its constituent parts?
Yes, into its usable
methylation
form.
was marking DNA.
No. So methylation is also called one-carbon metabolism. So basically what methylation is, I liken it to pulling crude oil out of the ground, right? So we take crude oil out of the ground, but we can't put crude oil into our gas tank, right? Because the car doesn't understand that fuel source. Crude oil has to be refined into gasoline. Now the car can operate. Human beings are no different. We put all kinds of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids into the human body, and the human body takes them and converts them into the usable form. If you can't make this conversion, you have a deficiency. And it is this deficiency that is robbing us from being in a state of optimization. It's this deficiency that leads to some of the most common conditions that we call genetically inherited disease. The whole concept of genetically inherited disease is in my opinion, such a fallacy. Yes, there are rare conditions that are true diseases that are passed from generation to generation. But why is it that 85% of all hypertension is idiopathic, meaning of unknown origin? And we say, well, Tom, your grandmother on your mom's side had hypertension. Your father and your grandfather had hypertension. Now you have hypertension. So you have familial hypertension. You have genetically inherited hypertension. If a doctor said that to me, I would say, well, what gene did I inherit that gave me that hypertension? Because they wouldn't be able to tell me, because that gene doesn't exist.
Okay, so I'll push on that one. So the gene might exist but not be known. It could be a confluence of 150 gene interactions, or it could be modern life. That was one of the big questions I want to ask you. So going through the research with you, that was the question I kept wondering, is this all like at a generic level for me, because I don't have the depth of medical knowledge that you have. But when I look at it, I'm just like, oh, we're out of step with how we came up from an evolutionary standpoint. There's just too many things that are off, like the fact that I never walk on the ground.
Right.
And so if nature has assumed, whoa, you're going to be in constant contact with the earth, and there's going to be whatever ion transfer, I don't know what's actually happening,
Right.
but whatever that is, I can expect it to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And now that it's not happening, things just start to knock on. And there's 100 things like that. Like, hey, I didn't expect you to drink diet sodas because those did not exist from an evolutionary standpoint. And now any one soda doesn't matter, but it starts to build up. Exactly. Yeah. So is this a DNA thing that we need to understand? Like, hey, Tom, you have the MTHFR mutation and you're not processing folate correctly. Or is it just that modern life is so anathema to the way that we evolved that this really is about going back to the basics, like you said?
Well, I think, if in a perfect world, you'd go back to the basics, right? Sunlight, grounding, breath work, being in regular contact with the earth, not eating processed foods, eating whole foods. In fact, my whole theory on dieting is not vegan, vegetarian, keto, paleo, carnivore. It's a whole food diet, right? It's usually not the food itself. It's the distance from the food to the table. I just got censored all over Instagram for doing a whole post on seed oils. And I said that industrial processed seed oils were bad for you. And people just came out of the woodwork. Seed oils are not bad for you. And I said, well, listen, if you take a canola plant and you put it in a commercial press and it comes out gummy, and then you degum it with hexane, which is a known neurotoxin, and then you heat that oil to 405 degrees and turn it rancid, and then you take that rancid neurotoxic oil and you deodorize it with sodium hydroxide, which is a known carcinogen. Now it's toxic. Yeah, maybe the original cold press canola plant wasn't going to harm you, but it's the distance from there to your table, right? It's the industrial processing that harms you. But back to that process of methylation, you could go down the role of genetic science until your eyes roll back in your head. But there are 5 major genes of methylation: MTHFR, MTR, MTRR, one called AHCY, and one called COMT. If you got a genetic test and you looked at which, if any, of those genes were operating and which ones are not operating, whether they were broken or not, and you simply supplemented for their deficiency, my hypothesis is it would get you 85 to 90% of the way to where you want to be, and it would pull so many anchors up off of your stern, it would be absurd. Anxiety, anxiousness, ADD, ADHD, OCD, manic depression, bipolar, poor gut issues, poor sleep, waking mind, poor focus and concentration. These all come from a lack of very specific nutrients in your body. And most of us do not have a clean enough diet and a clean enough fuel sources like the water that we're drinking to get there without supplementation. I believe everybody should be on a good methylated multivitamin, meaning don't worry about whether or not your body can break something down into the usable form. Feed it the usable form, right? So in other words, don't take folic acid, take methylfolate. Don't take cyanocobalamin, take methylcobalamin. So a good methylated multivitamin would fill in those gaps and give your body the raw material that it needs to do its job. In the absence of going out and actually getting a genetic test done, which I think everybody should do once in their lifetime because your genes never change, then you can begin to supplement for deficiency instead of just the sake of supplementing. Right? There's lots of incredibly good supplements out there, ashwagandha and CoQ10 and St. John's wort and all kinds of, vitamin C. I can make an argument for vitamin C. You can make an argument for all of these different supplements, but the question is, does your body need them? And how do you know? You have to know what your body can process and what it can't. And as soon as you know that piece of information, Now you supplement for deficiency and watch the magic happen. And this will affect, this process of methylation, Tom, is almost like the hub of a wheel with a whole bunch of spokes, right? So people with anxiety usually have three other conditions that they don't link to their anxiety, right? They have poor sleep, right? They have a hard time falling asleep because their mind keeps them awake, or they fall asleep and they wake up at night and they have a hard time going back to sleep because their mind wakes them up. Almost every person that suffers from rampant anxiety also has gut issues. And why does someone with anxiety have intermittent gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, irritability, and cramping? Because they don't actually have those conditions pathologically. They have them because the same gene and the same deficiency, methylfolate, that causes poor catecholamine regulation also causes poor intestinal motility. So they chase allergies all of their life. They're like, well, I went and got an allergy test done. I'm allergic to wheat, soy, corn, dairy, blueberries, bananas. I'm allergic to all this stuff. So I cut it all out of my diet. I'm like, okay, how's it going for you? I still get cramping. I still get bloating. I still get gas. I still get constipation. Okay, because it's not the contents of the gut. It is the pace of the gut. Remember, our intestinal tract is a 30-foot long conveyor belt. You put contents on it at one end, and as it exits the stomach, as it traverses the small intestine and eventually into the large intestine, the colon, and it exits the rectum, it goes from being very from being very acidic to being very alkaline. And the sequence of events is important. And just like any factory that's running on a conveyor belt system, if you walk in that factory and double the speed of the conveyor belt, or triple the speed of the conveyor belt, or even worse, reverse the speed of the conveyor belt, the entire assembly line would break down. But there's nothing wrong with the conveyor belt, or the part that's on the conveyor belt, or the people that are working there. It's not it's very often it's not the gut bacteria or the contents of the gut. It's the pace of the gut. So by missing these simple nutrients, you get the expression of all of these conditions, right? If I was able to magically go into your body and just deplete methylfolate or deplete the complex of B vitamins, I promise you your anxiety would come back like the tide. And when your anxiety came back, so would your sleep interruption and your gut issues. You would have a skyrocketing incidence of gas, bloating, constipation, irritability, cramping, and you may or may not relate it to that deficiency, but it is. When I was in the mortality space, I was reading medical records for a living for 20 years, and I read thousands and thousands and thousands of medical records, and I was pour through these medical records, and it was always astounding to me that you would see people with chronic conditions doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, and the chronic condition would never heal, right? So like people that would have chronic anemia, generally the treatment for that is, B12, folic acid, and iron. Well, 44% of the population can't process folic acid. So you're treating people that have anemia with folic acid, which they can't process. And so you keep feeding it to them, and the anemia never gets better. Some of those people would stumble upon methylfolate, the form that your body converts it into, and instantly the anemia would go away. Now, when the anemia goes away, the energy returns. When the energy returns, the sleep deepens. So you'd see this whole myriad of things get fixed just by putting the right raw material back into the human body. I mean, if I depleted vitamin D3 from your bloodstream, if I can magically go in and just deplete the sunshine vitamin, which I think is arguably the most important nutrient in the human body. It's the only vitamin, human beings make on our own. You start to deplete that, the first thing to fall is the immune system, right? Which is why D3 deficiency was the second leading cause of morbidity in COVID. It's also why vitamin D3 deficiency, which is more prevalent in minorities, made people say, well, COVID disproportionately affects minorities. That's true. It had nothing to do with them being a minority. It had to do with the pigment of their skin. The darker the pigment of the skin, the lower the vitamin D3. The lower the vitamin D3, the more compromised the immune system. The more compromised the immune system, the more susceptible you are to all kinds of viruses and pathogens, not the least of which is COVID. So this was an issue with a nutrient deficiency, D3, not an issue with a massive autoimmune, massive amount of immunocompromised people. This was an issue with a massive amount of nutrient deficiencies. And if you trace the nutrient deficiency in a human being and you find it and you put that raw material back into their body, they thrive in ways they just never could have imagined.
And how broad of a spectrum is the missing elements? So if I were to go and take a DNA test, am I going to fall into one of 5 categories or one of 500 categories?
One of about 5 categories, because we're human beings. We're all very, very similar, right? So these 5 genes are in every human, right? And they're the 5 methylated genes. And there are other genes that you could look into. I mean, like I said, you can really go down the rabbit hole of genetic testing, but what you want to find out is what basic raw materials that my body needs to perform the majority of its functions am I deficient in, right? The majority of us are deficient in vitamin D3. We're deficient in methylfolate, not folic acid. Folic acid, we've been led to believe, is a vitamin. It's not vitamin B9. Folic acid is an entirely man-made chemical. We make folic acid in a laboratory. You cannot find folic acid anywhere on the surface of the earth. It does not occur naturally in nature. And you'll never convince me that something that we synthetically make in a laboratory is somehow necessary for optimal health.
It's interesting. That's how I feel about supplementation in general. So anybody that's been following me for a while knows I don't do supplements. I will
because you have a good diet.
Yes, but that's not why I don't do supplements. The reason I don't do supplements is so often you hear, oh my God, this thing is like super critical. You've got to have it. Oh, sorry, by the way, it kills you. And the number of times, I'm at an age now where the number of times something started out as a miracle cure only to find out it causes cancer or whatever. Right. And so now I'm just super paranoid. Now, having said that, in full disclosure, because in the research, I heard you say that thing about methylated multivitamin. I literally bought one right away. I'm like, let me just try, because I don't have a philosophical problem with it. I just worry about isolating compounds. When you isolate a compound, who knows? Like, nature expects you to get things in a certain way. Right. So like, I'm always I do it. I want to be very honest, but it makes my radar every time I separate a yolk from an egg white. I'm like, nature doesn't expect me to separate these two things. And so is there some problem that you can generate? Anyway, so I'm a little paranoid about isolating compounds. So I guess in that sense, I'm very on board with being super skeptical of folic acid. But I'm also,
cyanocobalamin, that's the other one.
I'm also skeptical though of like metformin, all the rage. The number of people I've talked to, even off camera, who are like, bro, I was willing to say on camera, this is important. Even off camera, I'm telling you right now, like, I'm into this thing. And I just cannot bring myself to do it.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of metformin. Metformin has all kinds of secondary consequences. I mean, it's a good glucophage, but you can get, if you look at side-by-side clinical studies, that berberine, which is a root, performs better than metformin at not only just hemoglobin A1C, lowering hemoglobin A1C, which is the 3-month average of your blood sugar, but also controlling insulin levels. And there are virtually no side effects to berberine, right? Now, there's a trade-off to glucophages like metformin and some of these other ones, Ozempic, tirzepatide, GLP-1.
Really fast, just because it's a fancy word, and I'm married to a Greek woman. So phage means to eat, basically. So glucose eater is what they named
glucophage.
That. Nice.
But if you're morbidly obese and a type 2 diabetic, metformin could save your life, right? Like insulin could save your life. But the thing is, do you want to have a dependency on those things long term? And I would agree with you. The answer is no. I'm a huge fan of basic supplementation. If you're not getting enough vitamin D3, you should not be.
It's the one supplement I will take during the winter.
Okay.
Yeah, I hear you on that. So, so methylated multivitamin, what happens if I overdo it? What happens if I don't need it and I take it?
That's a good question. So number one, that's one of the reasons why you get a genetic test, because you can see if your body can methylate it or not. So if you know that if you don't have the gene that codes for the conversion of folate into methylfolate, for example, you can very safely supplement with methylfolate. But let's say that you over-supplement. The difference between over-supplementation with water-soluble vitamins and over-supplementing with fat-soluble vitamins is night and day. So A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble vitamins. You want to take those with food. If you are supplementing with them, you also want to be cautious about how high the levels get. If you look at most blood tests, there's even a range for vitamin D3. I think it goes
A, E, D, and K?
A, D, E, and K. I still remember from grad school, put your vitamins in the attic. A, D, E, K. Nice. And I still remember that analogy. So I sound really smart, but I just remember that from school. But so A, D, E, and K, those are fat soluble, so those actually can accumulate in tissues and what have you. But water soluble vitamins are meant sometimes to be in excess and sometimes to be in deficit, right? Because what if we when we were foraging around, ate high amounts of grass-fed animals for a period of time, and then ate high amounts of berries and foliage for a period of time. Well, you can't just say, well, at one period of my diet, I'm toxic, and the other one, I'm deficient. No, what happens is the body actually gets rid of those very easily. You let them go in the urine, which is why if you look at natural ranges for things like B12, it goes all the way up to 1,240, depending on the lab, nanograms per deciliter. Vitamin D3 goes from 30 to 100. It's not more toxic at 90 than it is at 70. 60 to 80 is the target range. But so you can safely, with water-soluble vitamins, if you were taking a methylated multivitamin, for example, you could get away with, maybe I got a little bit too much B12 and a little bit too much of the B complex. Now, massively supplementing with them is totally different. But when you take most, high quality methylated multivitamins, they're in a ratio that your body can get rid of, even if you met the nutrient requirement for your body across the entire spectrum. So there's very little risk with things like that, right? It's like D3. What if I got 30 minutes of sunlight one day and I got 2 hours of sunlight the next day without burning my skin? Am I at risk because I created more IUs of vitamin D3 in the prolonged sun exposure than I am when I had less sun exposure? No, you're not at risk. Your body's meant to survive and optimize in those ranges. You will know right away if you start taking a methylated multivitamin whether or not your anxiety, your anxiousness, and your gut issues are coming from a deficiency, because you will see those things near immediately take a backseat.
All right. So as people think about, I want to do something amazing with my life, I want to make sure that I'm cognitively optimized. We've talked briefly about, we know that you're going to get sleep, some diet things, but I want to now start going into the protocols. So if I want to really get killer sleep, what do I not do and what do I do?
So if you want to get really killer sleep, it starts in the morning, right? The best thing you can do for circadian rhythm is develop a relatively disciplined morning routine. And I have a morning routine, but I also think that what happens is that people that develop a morning routine and then quit it, or they do it kind of sometimes and don't do it sometimes, they're sort of doing themselves this disservice. They're breaking all these little promises to themselves. They go, I'm going to go to bed at 10 o'clock tonight. And they go to bed at 1:30 in the morning, right? They just consistently let themselves down. If you started with little nuggets, give yourself little wins. I'm going to go to bed at 10 o'clock tonight. Go to bed at 10 o'clock. And so with sleep, I would say there's 4 things. Number one, depending on where you live in the world, waking with the sun is arguably the best idea in the world, because morning light has a very special type of light. There's no UVA, there's no UVB rays in morning light, so you can't damage your skin. It has healthy blue light, not the kind of blue light that comes from your screen, but very healthy blue wavelengths of light that regulate not only melatonin, but they also regulate cortisol receptors. So it helps restore that circadian pattern. Also, going to bed around the same time, within an hour of your scheduled bedtime every single night. Going to bed at 10:30 one night and 1 a.m. the next night, and then midnight, and then 9:30, and then 2 o'clock in the morning, that is horrible for your circadian rhythm. And within 30 minutes of waking, do the same thing over and over and over again. So in other words, I wake up within 30 minutes of waking. I am out on my balcony with my skin exposed to sunlight, and I am doing 3 rounds of 30 breaths. If I can, I am touching the surface of the earth. If I can't, I sleep on a PEMF mat. But I wake up within 30 minutes, I've hydrated, and I've gone outside, and I've done 3 rounds of 30 breaths and exposed my skin to sunlight like clockwork. My wife will tell you I never, ever, ever miss.
Even in Colorado?
Even in Colorado.
In December?
In December, in January, in Colorado. I mean, aging is the aggressive pursuit of comfort. It's so sad that people don't want to go outside, it's too cold. They don't want to go outside, it's too hot. We got to stop telling grandma just to lay down, just to relax, to eat at the first pang of hunger. Aging is truly the aggressive pursuit of comfort. There's rarely a temperature that we can't deal with. But if you can't deal with the temperature outside, expose your skin to sunlight, even if you have to go sit by a window. right? But expose your
Does
skin to
that
sunlight.
count? So I wake up very early.
Okay.
And I often wonder, okay, so 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be in the midst of working. I'm not really going to notice when the sun is coming up.
Right.
But oftentimes I'll be like, oh, wow, yeah, I've been sitting here and the sun is now hitting me in my eyes and I'm noticing it. And I'm like, wait, do I need to go outside or is it okay that I'm getting the sunlight through the window?
It's okay to get the sunlight through the window. But what I'm saying is within 30 minutes of waking, have a routine that you do every day. So, for example, I use breath work to control my circadian rhythm.
Now, I have to imagine that it's not enough to do the same thing. I have to do the right thing over and over and over.
Right. I would say, so for example, for people that do breath work, develop a breath work routine. I do 3 rounds of 30 breaths with a breath hold in between.
What do you mean by that?
So,
what is a round of breathing?
So I do 30. It's a Wim Hof style of breathing. The reason why I like it is that no matter where I am in the world, you can do it. You can do it in a hotel room. You know, a few weeks ago, we were in 11 cities in 9 days. And some of them were on opposite sides of the world. I went from LA to Dubai and then Bahrain and New York. And so I was changing a lot of time zones. But within 30 minutes of waking every single day, I sat and oriented myself, preferably in sunlight. I couldn't always do it. But I did 3 rounds of 30 breaths. So I would take 30 obnoxiously deep breaths. I mean, literally, like my head had been underwater for a minute and a half, and I didn't think it was ever going to break the surface again. Right? Obnoxiously deep breaths. If you're in a hotel, people should think that there's some silliness going on in the room next to them. So, and on the 30th breath, I exhale, and I hold my breath as long as I can. And during that breath hold, I force myself to get outside of my head. Try to find like a car on the causeway, a bird in a tree, or try to find an airplane going by overhead, just something that I can key into outside of my body. So I'm not thinking about the fact that I want to breathe. Because contrary to popular belief, nitric oxide is not the major vasodilator in the body. Carbon dioxide is. So if you want to dilate your blood vessels first thing in the morning, which is a very good thing, then hold your breath for a prolonged period of time at the end of a series of breath rounds. You can start with as little as 5 breaths and hold, then do 5 deep breaths and hold, and then 5 more deep breaths and hold, and exhale and start your day. And work your way to 10 breaths, 15 breaths, 20 breaths, and then 30 breaths. So your body knows this is what we do every day. You know what? It's morning because he's breathing. Right. So when I would go from Miami to Dallas, Vegas, LA, Dubai. So there's 5 time zones or 4 time zones right there. But every morning within 30 minutes, I was doing 3 rounds of 30 breaths. Like I would set my circadian clock by that because I never, ever, ever miss. And it's free. And people don't give it the credence that it deserves because it's free. Like I wish I could charge it for it and patent it and sell it as a supplement, and then people might take it seriously. But the truth is that we all have 3 or 8 minutes to go find a place to sit down and just do a round of breath work. And if we do it at the same time every day, our body starts to get into that cycle. And then at night, I do box breathing, which is just a 4-second inhale, a 4-second hold, a 4-second exhale, and a 4-second hold. And I'll do 4 to 15 rounds of that. You try to get through 10 rounds of box breathing and see if your eyes are still not very, very, very heavy. Because when you think about tracing that square and you focus on your breathing and you don't carry your phone into bed and you haven't taken a tranquilizer before you go to bed, what happens is, you're actually clearing all of these catecholamines from the brain. I mean, Huberman talks on his podcast about, nasal breathwork techniques that actually calm anxiety. They're actually down-regulating these catecholamines, which are fighting most people's sleep, right? And so I use breathwork at night to get into that calm state. I don't take my phone into bed. You certainly don't want to be interacting with your phone. There's a difference between interacting with Instagram, like 1 second you're watching a fight and the next second you're watching somebody argue with their girlfriend, and the next second you're watching this guy speeding in a boat down the river, or reading, right? Reading on your phone in low light has a fraction of the waking impact that interacting with your phone has. where you're scrolling and you're clicking to another story and you're curious who posted, and then you look at their profile and you're scrolling through their profile. That activity is very stimulating to your brain. Reading is very calming for your brain. So I would say, develop a good breathwork technique at night. Get consistent about your morning routine. If you can, get into sunlight, touch the earth, do a round of breathwork, and take a cold shower instead of taking a regular shower.
Does it matter what time you go to bed?
I would prefer that you go to this bed at the same time every night than that you go to bed at a specific hour. Right? There is some research that says for every hour before you go to bed, before midnight, it compounds the amount of time you have to spend in bed after midnight. I haven't really been able to correlate that to any really sound clinical study, and I'm not an expert on sleep, but what I can tell you is that routine and consistency, especially with digestion, is the most important thing for your circadian clock. Like when people travel,
eat at the same time?
Eat at the same time and never eat during your sleeping window. So for example, like my biggest travel hack that I never hear anybody talk about is when you're constantly switching time zones, we are way more tied to digestion than we are the sleep-wake cycle of the sun, right? So let's say that
Finish.
Yeah.
I know where you're headed with this.
Taking notes. So let's say you live on the East Coast, right? So you live in Miami, and you go to bed at 10 p.m. and you get up at 6 a.m.
Yep.
Okay, so let's just say you go to bed at 10, you get up at 6. Now you go to London. Okay, so you're 6 hours ahead. If you're in London and you eat during your normal sleeping window, you're screwed. I don't care how much grounding, earthing, breath work, or sunlight exposure you get. You will never adjust to that time zone. So in other words, take your sleeping window from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and slide it to your new time zone, which would now be 4 a.m. to noon, right?
So you're still eating on Miami time.
So you're still eating on Miami time and not eating during your normal sleeping window. If you want to try this out, just set your alarm for 3:30 this morning. Wake up and have a 3-egg omelet and a slice of wheat toast and a fistful of berries and try to go back to bed. No chance.
Yeah, that would never work. Now, I will say, so I travel a fair amount, maybe not as much as you, certainly not at this point where you're really pounding the media tour.
Yeah.
But I travel a lot, and I'm married to a Brit, so I've done the LA to London thing many, many, many times. I've done LA to Tokyo. I've done LA to Dubai, LA to Kuwait, like all over the place. And my rule is always sun-based. So I get out and I get light in my eyes, light on my skin as much as I can, even in London where, I mean, for you, this would be nothing, but I'll go out not with my shirt off, but hiking up my sleeves as much as I can. And I will look up at the clouds for as long as I can bear, not into the sun, but like up at the sky, at the brightest part of the sky that I can bear without damaging my eyes.
Right.
Try to get as much light in as early as possible for as long as possible. But I don't worry at all about my eating window. So, in fact, I will eat on local time. And so, but I also use sleeping tablets when I travel, which you're probably going to hate. But it works like a charm. Like I really feel like I can switch fast. So Unisom, but Unisom has two variants.
Okay.
One makes me feel like I'm going to crawl out of my skin. It is unbearable.
Okay.
And then the other one, I feel I'm a little groggy the next day. I will admit, at least for the first couple of hours.
Right.
But I can transition to the point where I will sleep normally without sleeping pills very fast.
Okay.
As long as I stick to my routine, which is sun-based. So I've never heard anybody say that I've heard people tie diet to the circadian rhythm or the timing window of food to the circadian rhythm, but nobody ever say that it's more important than sun.
No question. We are way more tied to digestion because you think about what happens when we digest food, right? The amount of blood and therefore the amount of oxygen in our system is fixed. So it can't be here and here at the same time. Digestion is a very blood-intensive, oxygen-intensive process. This is why if you eat high glycemic foods, which raise your blood sugar very quickly, the reason why you get tired is because it takes more blood, more oxygen to digest those foods. Right. So if I stood you in front of a thermograph, that was reading the heat, in your body, and you saw that before you started to eat, your head was glowing bright red and orange, lots of heat, lots of oxygen in your brain. And then you eat a very high carbohydrate meal, basket of bread, some rice or a bowl of pasta, right, and had a glass of orange juice. Now, all of a sudden, you would watch as your head cooled and the blood left the head and it diverted to the intestinal tract. Well, everything that you perceive about energy is nothing more than oxygen in your blood. So if you told me, Gary, I had a lot of energy today, physiologically what you're saying is I had a lot of oxygen in my blood today. So if oxygen equals energy, which it does, then I want to be very cautious about diverting oxygen from my brain to my gut. One of the reasons why I always fast on airplanes, domestically, not internationally, but domestically, I always fast on airplanes because I don't want to divert that valuable oxygen to my digestive tract when I'm sitting, especially on an airplane.
Because there is limited oxygen on an airplane? I don't get that.
Well, because when nothing is worse than sitting for prolonged periods of time and eating. Nothing will kill your energy more than not moving and eating while you're sedentary, right? So I'm not saying you should move while you're eating, but if you're going to fly from Miami to LA, and it's going to take you 5 hours, and you're already tired because you caught a morning flight, and then you feed yourself on that flight while you're sitting, you'll be exhausted when that plane lands. And there's nobody that cannot fast just on airplanes on domestic flights, right? I mean, tomorrow I'm going LA to New York for the UFC fights. I'm going to fast on the plane. Now, I might eat before I get on the plane, and I'll be moving around the airport and what have you. But when I get on the airplane, it's either black coffee or water, and that's it, while I'm domestically flying. But my whole point is when you get to your new destination, back to your London trip, for the first 48 hours, that was the part that I didn't say, for the first 48 hours, and if you're going to be there much longer than 48 hours, then you can make that time adjustment. But for the first 48 hours, do not eat during your normal sleeping window and watch how quickly you adjust to that time zone. In addition to getting sunlight on your skin, that also really helps because you're right. We're tied to the circadian cycle of the sun, but more so to digestion.
Let me ask though, so if let's say that I'm going to London to adjust. So I'm going to be there for 2 weeks.
Okay.
My plan would be, again, sun-based, and I'm going to eat based on my normal schedule in the new place. So for me, because I wake up so early, I never eat before the sun comes up. I typically eat several hours after the sun gets up. So like on a day like yesterday where I woke up at 2:45 a.m., which by the way, I don't set an alarm. This is not me championing. You should get as much sleep as humanly possible. You should get a lot of sleep. Get as much sleep as you can. I don't set an alarm. But there are times in my life where I'm 9 p.m. like it's a religion.
So 9, that's not bad.
Yeah, it's not horrible.
But see, and now I like what you just said. 9 p.m. like it's religion.
Correct.
That is so good for you. And the fact that you just said it with such conviction, you go to bed at 9 p.m., that's a little psychological win for you every night. If you went to bed at 11:30, you'd be really disappointed in yourself.
Correct. Yeah, we probably should talk about identity later. Let's stick with the more sort of dietary, tactical ones for the moment. So I would I'm going to go to bed so I have rules. Don't go to bed before 9 p.m. if you're in a new time zone. If you can stretch it to 10, even better. So if you arrive at 11 a.m., sorry, tough break. If it's a huge time zone change, you're going to be exhausted, but you need to stay up. Get up, move around, go do something that's engaging. Don't go to bed before 9. Go to bed at 9. I take sleeping tablets the first few nights in an ever-decreasing amount. And then I'm going to eat on my normal thing. So like I said, if I wake up at 2:45, I'm not going to eat before 8 or 9 a.m. Because again, it ties to the sunlight. So I'm trying to get sun exposure before I eat. I want my body to fully understand this is awake time. This is not bedtime. So also I'm trying to stretch the number of hours. I keep I do intermittent fasting 365 days a year.
Awesome. So
my average ends up being over the course of a year, 17 hours. So on the weekends, shorter. On the weekdays, it can go up as high as 20
So you
hours.
start to eat at, you said 9?
That's usually when I eat.
And you're done eating
8:30 and 9.
And you're done eating at what, 2?
My first meal?
3, 4?
Yeah, so I eat my last meal at 2.
Okay.
Which normally people would look at me like I have roaches on my face, even after I tell them the number of hours. So the math is what the math is.
Right.
But yeah, so I eat my last meal at 2, which is very socially awkward.
Right.
But
Probably the reason why you sleep so good too, though.
I don't sleep great. So I average 6 hours and 3 minutes according to my Oura Ring.
Okay.
I would love to average 7 hours. Would be, I think, better.
I'm gonna do a cheek swab on you. I'm gonna look at your genetic profile, and I'm gonna give you a specific, safe, water soluble supplement for catecholamine regulation, because I would bet my entire career that you have a gene mutation called COMT.
God, I hope so.
Catechol
The anxiety
or
thing is the only one I
methyltransferation.
care about. I can deal with the way that I sleep. In fact,
Well, they're both going to go at the same
secret
time.
plan. Yeah.
They're both going to go at the same time because they're both related to excess catecholamines. If you look at serum concentration studies of catecholamines in the urine, they are highly linked to anxiety. And I'd be happy, for the people that are the really, the science nerds that are watching this podcast. Can I send you the links and you put them in the notes of the podcast?
Yeah,
Okay, so that's what I want to do, because in case people want to really go and look at the research, because methylation research is relatively new. We only mapped the human genome completely in 2009. Right, so a lot of methylation genetic science and the science behind supplementing for deficiency is brand new. We'd rather actually chase mental illness than a lack of mental fitness. And I think people are less mentally fit than they are mentally ill.
Yeah, look, as the science comes out, that I'm very, very eager to recognize that I am creating my own problems. That I can, because I really don't find it interesting to be like, oh, my mom had anxiety and I have anxiety, and oh, I guess it just is what it is.
Right.
It's like, I want to figure out what's the thing, what am I doing in my modern lifestyle that's causing me a problem, what can I do to change it? I have an obscene amount of discipline. So whatever works, I will do. I am obsessed with efficiency,
Right.
effectiveness. And so, yeah, if I really do have COMT, and that's my problem, and I can supplement, that would be amazing. I love me a good blood draw, so I would happily partake in a cheek swab, blood draw, whatever, so that we
We've
can
got an
figure
office
out.
in Beverly Hills. I'll send the doc here and we'll get a little.
That would be amazing. The key is, though, because I have this frequently with guests, they will come on, we will do all this, and then I never get a chance to connect with them about what we find. Like, that's the next thing, because
we'll come back on and do it. You want to do it on we'll do a follow-up. I'm sure the audience would love to see that. Because
and then, most importantly, then the follow-up, whatever, 6 months later, to see if this actually worked. Because when I don't feel anxious, I feel superhuman. The number of times I've said that to my wife, if I could snap and just not a certain level of anxiety is useful. I like that I take things seriously. That's something that I appreciate in my makeup. But man, if I had a dial and I could just turn that down a bit, that would be amazing.
Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to turn you into a superhuman. Do you think that you work well under pressure?
Yeah.
You find yourself saying that a lot?
No.
Good.
What I do believe is that I am an unstoppable machine that can't be killed. And so no matter how much pressure the situation has, I will not allow it to break me. So I have been through obscene things where you're so distressed you can't sit on furniture. Have you ever had that?
Wow.
It's not a fun feeling. But I was like, I'll get back up. I will put myself back together. It was very weird.
Wow.
But anyway, so
was this just from anxiety?
No, this is from when hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line and shit is real.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, like, things can get pretty heavy pretty fast. So I have a vice. That vice is stress. I have for sure shortened my life by my willingness to run into hyper stressful situations.
Right.
Because I love the game of life. I think you can win the game of life. It isn't money, for anybody wondering, but it is meaning and purpose.
Yes.
So
I
anyway,
would agree with that, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because the COMT gene mutation has two. If you actually do any research on this gene mutation, you'll find that there's two categories. They're called warriors, like a warrior.
Yes.
Or worriers, that worry constantly. So you have the warrior side, which is.
I would say I'm a worrier by nature, and I'm a warrior by identity creation.
Because the warriors are the ones that The warriors are the ones that have what we call consummate overachiever profile, which means that you hold yourself to an obscenely high standard.
That is correct.
And you can find yourself very easily disappointed in other people because you feel like they just can't do the basics.
Ironically, I'm the exact opposite.
That's good.
Because I know how hard it was. Because
So
I
you're
know how
empathetic even to people that just
by
don't
nature
do the
I
basics.
am weak and soft. And my journey to success was one of learning to get hard,
So you hold yourself to a high standard, but then you don't hold the people around you to the same
which is
standard.
problematic. Which is
Gotcha.
very problematic. In
Because usually
terms of
that
growing a
doesn't,
business.
that's a kind of a strange dichotomy because usually people that hold themselves to a very high standard, right? Socioeconomically, physically, mentally, routine, like you said, I have a lot of discipline. I like that you said you go to bed at 9:30, like religion. I mean, it just shows that level of conviction. Usually that expectation trickles over to the people in their sphere where you're like, hey, brother, you can't even just do the basics. Like, this comes easy for me.
Here's the bad news. So I have all the empathy in the world, but the question I will ask anybody that's struggling with it, because I love you and I want to see you do well, and now what? So sure, it's harder for you than the next person. I get it, but now what? So it breaks my fucking heart to see people struggle. And as an entrepreneur, my biggest problem is I do not fire underperformers nearly fast enough. Because I want to see them do well. My whole sense of identity is it doesn't matter who you are today, it matters who you want to become and the price you're willing to pay to get there. And so I really invest in creating a space where people can pay that price and rise up. So that is a
They
huge
really
thing
have to
for me.
fire themselves to get.
Yeah,
to be
I mean, I
fired.
try not to be that ridiculous, but I do really struggle with that because I can see there. But for the grace of God go I. There, but for the grace of God go I? Yes, correct. That phrase makes a lot of sense to me. That could have just as easily been me. If I hadn't encountered a certain set of ideas,
Right.
that would have been me. And so I have empathy. But empathy won't help you. Your life is still going to suck. So even if I give you a ton of sympathy even,
Right.
and I'm just like, oh my God, poor you, like I want to help, or empathy, I totally get it. Neither of those are going to get you where you want to go. You have to become a hardcore motherfucker. There just is no, there is no excuse. It's actually very interesting seeing you in person because you're actually fit.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people have great ideas, but they can't control their body.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm like, ooh, that to me tells me everything I need to know about where you're at currently, not your future potential. You still have all the potential in the world.
Right.
But if you can't transform your potential into usable skill set through discipline and relentless focus and action, your life will never be what you want it to be.
So true. Yeah, and I think it puts you out of alignment too. It's like, what's the saying? Never trust a skinny chef.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, if you're a really good chef, wouldn't you be eating all the time?
I get the statement, but of course I would say
It's
never
a
trust an
metaphor, I know, I
undisciplined
know.
chef.
Yeah.
And if they can't control what they put in their mouth, then God only knows.
Right.
So yes, but this to me is the reason that I do what I do, despite I never need to work again. But I am so convinced that there is this thin veneer between where people are and success. And that thin veneer is just a set of ideas. You have a bad set of ideas that lead you to be undisciplined. Discipline really is the secret thing that unlocks everything. The question becomes, and
Yeah, I agree with that.
I want to ask you,
Discipline's
what
better
do
than
you tell
motivation.
people, as somebody who clearly has a lot of discipline, what do you say to somebody who just can't get themselves to do it?
I say set very, very, very small, short-term achievable goals for yourself. Just like you said, tell yourself you're going to go to bed at 10 o'clock and go to bed at 10 o'clock. You have to learn to trust yourself before you actually can gain the discipline, I think, to even be an entrepreneur, develop good work habits. You have to actually gain your own trust. And so the only person that knows that you keep letting yourself down is yourself. Right? So you go, you know what, I'm going to start working out tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to, I bought this weight set. I put it in the other room. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to get up. I'm going to do 25 air squats and 25 push-ups. And I'm going to do that breath work that I heard on Tom's podcast. And then you don't. Right? And I think that degrades your belief and your confidence in yourself. And once that's gone, your ability to get outside of that and develop any kind of work ethic, in my opinion, is eroded. Right? It just has to start with the little incremental wins for yourself. You can lie to everybody else, but just don't lie to yourself. Right? I mean, you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, well, you know, I like what Gary said on that podcast, and it's not going to cost me a dime to wake up every morning. Within 30 minutes, I'm going to find a place to sit down, expose my skin to sunlight, and I'm going to do 3 rounds of 30 breaths. And give yourself that win and start doing that every single day. And as you actually get in the habit of being disciplined to the promises that you make to yourself, it makes other promises you make even to other people become that much more likely to be fulfilled, in my opinion.
Most people still won't do it. And
I
the
know.
reason I think they won't do it is there's 2 things. One, identity, but identity is ultimately going to be the outcome of wanting it badly enough. And
Well, wanting it badly enough, but then also, like you said, you have to put it into action.
which
Right.
you won't do though if you don't want it badly
Yeah.
enough. What do you? So for me, the foundation is desire. That's it. If you don't have desire, nothing else will happen. What's the foundation for you?
Well, I would say that's desires are probably the same motivator. I mean, it's if you have desire, then you can actually develop the discipline. And I'm with you too. I think that discipline is more important than motivation, right? Because motivation kind of comes and goes. People wait to get motivated to work out rather than the discipline to work out. It's kind of the David Goggins method. I think about it when every time I walk up to a cold plunge, I always have 5 other things that I'd rather do. Mm-hmm. And I walk up to the cold plunge and I take my shorts off and I take my shirt off and I do 4 deep breaths and I get in the water while I'm negotiating with myself that I should just go down and get a cup of coffee, or maybe I'll just do my breath work first, or you know what, maybe I'll just go check on Sage real quick. And, instead of negotiating with myself, I just get in a cold plunge. So that's what I do. Wake up. That's the thing I did mention. I wake up, brush my teeth, splash water on my face. And before I even walk to the kitchen and start breath work or sit out in the sunlight, I get in a cold plunge.
Really, before the breath work?
Yeah. It's my cold plunge is right. I mean, I have my bed, bathroom, cold plunge. And so I literally wake up, go to the bathroom, I walk over to my sink, splash water on my face, I brush my teeth, I walk in the other room, and I get in the cold plunge. And the entire time, I'm thinking about reasons why I don't want to get in the cold plunge.
Don't I know it?
And the entire time that I'm walking over there. And then usually I'm about 15 seconds in the water, and I'm like, shit, I'm in the cold plunge. Because I just do it as a matter of discipline. But I've never regretted it once, when I've gotten out. But I think that, back to your, theory on really supporting people and trying to, figure out how much rope can I give them to become the person that they truly have the potential to become. I think that developing that discipline, and also back to what you were saying about diet, your diet or your supplementation or your lack thereof has a massive impact on your capacity to function optimally, and that includes your mental state. Because we know, and you're probably well aware of this, that there's a very interesting study by MIT in 2016. They published a study that irrevocably proved that the amygdala in the brain, where we feel emotion, is the sole gateway to the hippocampus, to where our memory is stored. Right? So there's essentially one corridor that we can travel down to enter our memory, and it is through the hippocampus. It's through the emotional state of the body. So in other words, your current emotional state does determine what memories you retrieve. The memories that you retrieve also project into your conscience and help determine your future. So your current emotional state, if it determines what memories you retrieve, and your memories you retrieve determine what projects into your conscience, then it really means that your current emotional state determines your future. So if we could help people get control of their emotional state, which begins with having the right raw materials and the right physiology in your body, so you actually can experience the full spectrum of emotion, then I think you give people a better shot at walking into the future that they want to design for themselves. But if you don't learn to control your emotional state, you'll never control your future.
I agree so aggressively, I'm getting cramps.
Really?
So
you agree so aggressively, you're getting cramps?
Yes.
I don't think I've ever heard it put that way.
So
you're
yes.
so calm when you say these big dramatic things.
Yeah,
I agree so aggressively, I'm getting cramps.
Yes. So
You're a character, dude.
Thank you, sir. I think that going back to the idea, you're having a biological experience. I want to scream that at people so that they understand, okay, you're having a problem. you're going to blame yourself. You're going to say you're a loser. Stop. Remember that this is a biology problem. Solve for the biology. You're missing something.
Amen.
If you are, look, some of this is psychological. There is no doubt, but the psychology is built on top of the biology. And if you, I mean, look, it is a feedback loop. There is no doubt. But if you're going to give me one lever to pull, I'm going to pull the biology lever first and foremost, most aggressively, because if you have all the desire in the world, but you cannot create the ATP, you're not going to be able to do the things you want to do. Like when people ask me how I have so much energy, how I can work so hard, all that, I'm like, well, first of all, at a cellular level, I can generate the energy to do the things that I want to do.
So true.
And I'm so focused on my energy levels, my biology. I eat based on my goals. I sleep based on my goals. Like I do all the things that I need to do to optimize my biology because I'm trying to do these things, and goals make demands.
Right.
So if you're trying to be the best parent, if you're trying to be an entrepreneur, if you're whatever, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. You are going to have to be able to be hyper persistent. You're going to have to be completely determined. There's a great quote, he's a super famous coach, but he said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." And I always thought, ooh, that's something. To think that I have a completely different personality when I'm fatigued.
Oh, no doubt.
That's one of those.
And you're also in a low oxidative state. Yeah.
I think that I have never thought about it in terms of oxygen because I don't know the process well enough. But that makes a lot of sense to me that whatever thing we're describing, if we're using a sort of blunt tool like the word fatigue, or we're really down into the weeds and the answer is oxygen and the rate at which it's traveling through your system, it's the same idea. Your physiology is stopping you at some level from doing the thing you want to do. And this was an idea introduced to me by Jordan Peterson, where he said, we have micro personalities. And he's like, when you're in a certain mood, and he always used the example of an alcoholic. You have an alcoholic, they're a different version of themselves, entirely different set of morality, the way they act, whether they're aggressive, whether they're willing to lie, like all these things. Like they slot into a very knowable set of personality traits when they're after their next drink. And when I thought, ooh, that's really interesting. So I have a different micro personality when I'm feeling really anxious that I don't respect in myself. That doesn't mean I don't respect other people dealing with it. I'm just saying one of the things that I do to pull myself out of that is I just do not allow myself to stay there. Now, of course, I need to address the biology as well. But it's like that's the feedback loop. You have to get the biology right, but you also have to get the mindset right because they are going to feed back to each other in this never-ending
But the mindset
loop.
is born from the biology. You know, we talked earlier about what is a mood, what is an emotional state. It's this collection of neurotransmitters. Manufacturing those neurotransmitters, creating the supply, and then once you create the supply, learning to regulate it is a part of what creates all these little anchors that are off of our stern, right? And we talked about anxiety, but you know, so many of these, especially in the entrepreneurial community, they quote unquote suffer from ADD or ADHD, but we don't really realize that attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, these are not really attention deficits at all. They're actually attention overload disorders, right? There are too many windows open at the same time. You know, people that have ADD or ADHD don't lack the ability to pay attention. They lack the ability to pay attention to so many things, right? So, for example, you know, in the human mind, we know well that we don't just create thought, right? We also dismantle thought. We actually downregulate thought, or else you'd always be in the same mood. You'd always think the same thing. How do we transfer from mood to mood? You experience a mood, you have a stimulus, it creates a certain cascade of neurotransmitters. Then those neurotransmitters are degraded and you no longer feel that mood. You no longer feel that emotional state. So if that process is too fast or too slow, then you can hold on to things for a prolonged period of time. You know, like my wife and I have different methylation, and we do, you know, we hold on to things very differently. If we have friction in the morning, by the time I walk out of the bedroom, I've totally forgotten we even had an argument. Like I'll walk back in the bedroom and be like, babe, you want some coffee? And she's like, are you seriously talking to me right now? I'm like, yeah. She's like, we just had a massive fight. And I'm like, that was like 10 minutes ago, right? Are we still fighting? Because she's like, well, you didn't apologize to me. I'm like, well, I'm sorry. I mean, they just leave my body like instantly. But she can hold on to those. So what is the difference between these things? It's the rate at which we break these things down. People with attention deficit disorder, which is so prevalent, have they have a slow breakdown of these neurotransmitters that allows thought to continue to pile on top of thought, on top of thought, on top of thought. And that's why the mind gets clouded. It's not that they can't pay attention, it's that they can't pay attention to so many things. Right? And usually this is also nutrient deficiencies, which is why diet can actually make ADHD or an ADD much worse, or it can actually make it much better. Methylfolate, for example, the primary nutrient that actually helps downregulate neurotransmitters, when that's deficient, people will go from thought to thought to thought.
Trust me, cold plunging is amazing. It is all it is hyped up to be. Lisa and I both do this all the time. And if you have one of the beautiful tubs from Plunge, you really can train your mind while you train your body to adapt to uncomfortable situations with every plunge. Get in the cold water, center yourself, get focused. It is amazing the way that it will toughen your mind. And the great news is the sleek ones from Plunge have amazing tech that makes it super fast and easy to set up. You can use them indoors or outdoors with no plumbing required. Build your resilience, get tough, and be able to tackle difficult problems. Just go to plunge.com and use the code IMPACT to get $150 off your incredible cold plunge tub today. Again, that's code IMPACT for $150 off your purchase at plunge.com, or you can find the link in the show notes.
And so they'll be thinking about a job they're working on, and their friend walks up, and they're thinking about a job, they start talking to their friend, and then they notice a logo on their friend's jacket that reminds them of a vacation that they want to take. And now they're thinking about a job, talking to their friend, looking at a logo, thinking about a vacation they want to take, all at the same time, because they haven't degraded those previous thoughts. I mean, I think that when you're talking about the foundation being like sunlight, sleep, blood sugar control, I couldn't agree more. But the other that I would add to that is diet and or targeted supplementation.
I'm going to add something weird to the conversation here. The thing that I will add is I think that there's not enough consequence in people's lives. Like when you are in a modern context, there's so many safety nets. You can be in an air-conditioned room. You don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, certainly for the vast majority of people in the West. Mm-hmm. And anecdotally, from just my own experience as somebody who was diagnosed with hyperactivity disorder when I was a kid, they would almost certainly call it ADHD now. Mm-hmm. The way that it feels is I'm doing this thing, I hit a moment of discomfort, and my brain goes, oh, cool, here's another thing to think about that isn't as uncomfortable as that thing. And then when that one gets comfortable, here's another thing to think about that. And so I'm constantly having to force myself to come back to the task. When, however, the stakes are high, and this is why I think a lot of people say I work best under pressure, is you need the sense of like, holy shit, the world is going to end or something very bad is going to happen if I don't do this. And so you're just waiting for that moment where it clicks over, and now the stakes suddenly feel high enough and you have to address it. Mm-hmm. And so I call this, some people need to be chased by a lion. And when you're being chased by a lion, that's real clarifying. That is the only thing you're going to be thinking about and dealing with at that moment.
I agree with that too. But I mean, if your whole life depends on you being chased by a lion, I mean, the amount of stress that you put yourself under is, in a lot of cases, is highly unnecessary. What if you actually, instead of giving equal priority to all of the tasks that come into your mind, which is what happens when you open thought at a faster rate than you degrade it, you start to actually give equal priority to every thought that's coming into your mind. So like you're closing on the dream home of a lifetime, right? And you got 40 minutes to get the paperwork back to the broker, or you could potentially lose this house for good. And you're working on the paperwork and you get a ding on your phone and you're like, oh, it's an Instagram message, and it's your neighbor's cousin's kid fishing in a lake. And you're like, well, I wonder if he catches the fish. And so you start, this is going to have zero impact on your life. And you're just curious. You start looking at that. And then all of a sudden you feel that, well, I don't have 40 minutes left. I got 30 minutes. And I don't have 30 minutes. I got 25 minutes. And now that external pressure forces you to drop the phone, hyper focus on what you're doing, and at 4:59 you get the paperwork back to the broker, and you're like, I work well under pressure. Right? You're essentially, from a physiological standpoint, you're saying I lack the ability to set priorities internally, so I use external priorities to set I use external pressure to set my priorities. And this is how most people go through life, because they don't have that proper balance of neurotransmitters, either in the supply or the demand. And so now equal weight gets given to every single thought. And they're labeled ADD or ADHD, or their mind is very clouded, right? And the more disorganized we are in the mind, the more we crave organization in our outside environment, which is essentially what OCD is, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder is obsessively trying to control the environment around you because you're so disorganized in the mind. So people whose minds are not cluttered are not bothered by clutter in their outside environment. People that have very active minds are bothered very much by clutter in their outside environment. You know, if they're going to study, not only does the desk they're studying on have to be clean, but the room the desk is in has to be clean. They notice that sock against the baseboard, and they got to go pick it up and put it in the hamper before they can actually sit back down and work on a project. And this is an effort to clean up the outside environment to save them from the chaos that's going on internally.
Because I don't have OCD, that is not one that I can comment on in terms of what it feels like internally. Mm-hmm. So that makes a lot of sense. I don't know the science well enough to know whether I agree, disagree. It certainly has internal logic and makes a lot of sense. If you're having trouble distinguishing between the prioritization of a given thought, mm-hmm. I think my gut instinct is people will find, even if they solve for that problem, kind of like anxiety, solving the diet problem stopped it from being generalized, mm-hmm. but didn't stop it when there really was something that was high stakes. But I felt like my anxiety is now spilled over into an unusable format.
Right.
And so even if I were to 100% solve the physiological component of this, there still is going to be a certain amount of just mental.
I don't think we ever want to just not be able to feel anxiety, right? I think what we want to be able to do is feel anxiety in situations where we should feel anxiety. I mean, if you're claustrophobic and you step on a crowded elevator, or if you're afraid of heights and you walk to the edge of a 30th floor balcony, those are completely different scenarios than us having a conversation like we are right now and me starting to become consumed with anxiety, to the point where you're now speaking to a facade because internally I'm trying to manage my feeling of anxiousness and anxiety. And this is where a lot of people lie, right? They don't fake anxiety, they fake being okay. Right? Like most people don't fake depression, they fake being okay.
Talk to me about depression.
Well, what's interesting about depression is when I was in the life insurance business, when I was in the mortality space, the prevailing we've now disproven the serotonin hypothesis, but the prevailing hypothesis at the time was that depression was due to low levels of serotonin. This is the whole concept behind SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we said, if you were low on serotonin, you were by definition depressed. And I remember I used to think all the time, well, if the definition of depression is low serotonin, then why are we not trying to raise serotonin? Because that's not what we did.
SSRI does attempt to raise the availability, right? So it's saying keep it in the system so it's available. Don't
it doesn't actually really raise serotonin. What it does is it rations what little serotonin you have. And the way that it rations is it inhibits the receptors that uptake
So you're serotonin. Saying what they should have done is how do you get it to produce more?
So you instead of having a full cup of water, you've got a quarter cup of water. So now but it has to last you all day. So you just sip on it all day, instead of whacking it back all, in the morning, having a massive emotional response in the morning, and then the coffee being able to, the cup being able to fill itself the rest of the way back up. So the methylation of these neurotransmitters, like we talked about, it begins in the gut, right? I mean, 90% of the neurotransmitter production in our bodies happens in the gut before it travels up the vagus nerve and it goes into the brain and it's secreted by, it's not made in the brain, but it's secreted by the brain. And so the supply of these neurotransmitters is heavily tied to this gut-brain axis. And so, certainly depression can begin in the outside environment. There are plenty of traumatic events that can cause people to be depressed, but people that suffer from prolonged depression. I mean, I've had people come in to see me that and I ask them, How long have you been on antidepressants? And they say 15 or 18 years. I mean, my first question is always, when did you think it was going to kick in?
That's a great question.
I mean, when did you think it was going to kick in? And by that time,
it usually helps them just enough that they remain hopeful.
Yeah, that they remain hopeful, which is super sad to me because, you know, I always use this analogy that when I was in grad school, I was getting my second human biology degree, and I had to take all these plant botany courses, which I absolutely hated, but you have to take them to get the degree. Morphology of thallophytes and like all this nonsense. But what really struck me about these courses is that anytime there was something wrong in a bush, tree, shrub, right? If you were to actually call a true arborist or true botanist out to your house, and you got a palm tree and the leaves are rotting in the palm tree, they actually won't touch the leaves, the branches, the trunk of the tree. The first thing they'll do is they'll core test the soil, right? And they'll go, you know what, there's no nitrogen in the soil. And then they'll add nitrogen to the soil and the leaf will heal. But we don't think about human beings like this anymore. We've lost so much faith in mankind and so much faith in humanity and the ability of this to heal this. And so when we look at nutrient deficiencies in the soil causing disease all the way up in the leaf, you have to look at nutrient and physiological deficiencies in the body causing issues in the brain. You know, things that we call mental disease, mental disorders. If you actually boil down the majority of mental disease or mental conditions, they, at their root cause, they are a lack of raw material. Right? They're missing nutrients in the human body, causing the physiology to misbehave. Just like I said, just taking butter away from a bakery chef. Right? It's a single ingredient, but it's a necessary part of so many recipes. If I said you can bake whatever you want, you just can't use butter, even though it doesn't sound like a big deal because it's one ingredient, it would affect so many recipes. When you go into the gut and you deprive the gut of its process of methylation, which is the creation of a lot of these neurotransmitters, you lack supply. When you lack supply, you lack the capacity to create certain mood, and then we call this a disease or a mental disorder or a mental condition where you have ADD or ADHD or OCD or manic depression or bipolar or you're schizophrenic or you're any number of things. You have generalized anxiety or generalized depression. I don't think the human beings break down that bad, and certainly not in the numbers that we have going on in the United States. I think that we have a lack of mental fitness secondary to a lack of nutrients in the human body. And the majority of our diets lack basic nutrients. The majority of our routines lack the capacity to give us the basic physiology so that we don't have a mental condition.
Okay, so to say that super succinctly, if you have depression, there is a nutrient deficiency going on that has to do with methylation. We can do a genetic test and figure out what you're most likely having a hard time creating.
Yes.
Is there one, so we talked earlier, there's basically 5-ish buckets that people break down into. Is depression a known of those 5 buckets? Is it a combination of different buckets?
Depression depending, it's a combination of different buckets, but what's astounding is you see people that can't, for example, have a deficiency in SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine, SAMe. So what happens in the human body is we take a normal amino acid called homocysteine. We break this amino acid down into another harmless amino acid called methionine. Methionine goes up into the brain. It quiets the mind. It helps to actually break down neurotransmitters. And it eventually becomes something called S-adenosylmethionine, SAMe. People that have deficiencies in SAMe, that has been linked to depression. I'm not saying that every person that's depressed needs to take something called SAMe. Nor am I saying that every person that's depressed has a methylfolate deficiency. But if you look at research into folate deficiency, B-complex deficiency, and SAMe deficiency, you will find enormous correlations between the rate of depression and the rate of deficiency in those specific nutrients, SAMe, B-complex, and methylfolate. And these are highly prevalent in ancestral diets. They are highly absent in the modern diet.
How did we historically get those things in?
Historically, we got them from fruits, cruciferous vegetables, and grass-fed meats. Meat, fish, chicken, eggs, yes, even dairy, and cruciferous vegetables and and fruits. But now, a lot of these, and what impairs the ability for us to draw these nutrients out of a lot of fruits, for example, are pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and preservatives. When we first came up with preservatives, they were actually called anti-digestives. But, and then some smart marketer said, well, shit, people aren't going to go to the anti-digestive part of the supermarket, so we need to change that name. We'll call it preservatives. It's just like we spray all of our grains with folic acid in the United States. We spray all white flour, all white pasta, all white bread, and all white rice in the United States is sprayed with the chemical folic acid. You don't have a choice over that unless you buy organic. It is all fortified or enriched. See, they don't call it sprayed with folic acid. They call it fortified or enriched. They don't call it anti-digestive. They call it preserved. So it's really hard for us to navigate this maze. I mean, the food pyramid is the worst thing to ever happen to humanity. I ought to flip that thing exactly upside
Because
down.
it has people intaking so much glucose?
Because it has people taking in so much glucose and so much high glycemic carbohydrate. I mean, people that eat the most sugar have the highest blood fat. People that eat the most sugar are the fattest because, sugar raises our level of insulin. And the primary role of insulin, yes, well, portion of its role is to actually metabolize glucose and move glucose into the cell. A very large role of the hormone insulin is to block any other form of energy use in the body. And so when sugars are high, insulin is high. When insulin is high, we can't access the fatty acid pathway. So what happens? Fat begins to build up. Well, where's the first place fat builds up? In the blood, in the form of something called a triglyceride. Well, as triglycerides begin to rise, it makes the size of the cholesterol molecule smaller. As cholesterol gets smaller in particulate size, it gets more dangerous. Two people with the exact same LDL cholesterol level, one could be a marker for longevity, and the other one could be a marker for cardiovascular disease, depending on the particulate size of that molecule. Because remember from high school geometry, as the size of a sphere gets smaller, its surface area to volume ratio goes up. So if you had two basketballs of cholesterol and you transport fat, triglyceride, around the blood on the surface of these two basketballs, and now I add more fat, right? But I only have two basketballs. I have to make these 4 softballs. And then I add more fat. I have to make them 8 baseballs. And I add more fat. I have to make them 16 golf balls. And then I have to make them 32 little BBs. I've never changed the amount of cholesterol. I've changed the size of the cholesterol to increase the surface area to carry more fat. And this is why when we eat high amounts of sugar and we have high insulin in the blood and triglyceride builds up in the blood, it starts to make our cholesterol more dangerous. This is why that triglyceride to cholesterol ratio is actually more important than the cholesterol level. And
okay, there's a few ideas here I want to tease out. One, have you seen Lane Norton's video about cholesterol?
no. What does he say?
Well, it'd be better if you'd seen it. I'll do my best, but I may not be able to give you enough specifics. So what he was saying is that the smaller particles penetrate the
Arterial
wall more frequently
and get eaten by a macrophage. Yeah.
According to him, they have less, a smaller amount of cholesterol in them. Yes, I think that's correct. And then the larger ones don't penetrate as often, but when they do, they have a larger deposit of cholesterol. And so that the studies show, according to him, again, I'm just trying to do my best to accurately represent what he said, that it ends up, the literature says that it ends up being a wash, that it isn't the size of the cholesterol that matters. That's as close as I can get you to what he said.
Did you talk about whether or not it was glycated or whether or not?
We'd have to play the clip.
Let's see what Gary has to say about LDL cholesterol. I'm sure it is going to be right in line with all of the scientific literature, and he's not going to embellish, exaggerate, or misrepresent claims at all.
Here's the myth about cholesterol, guys. I mean, I'll tell you this right now. Cholesterol is the most maligned and misunderstood compound in the entire human body.
Actually, it's one of the most studied compounds in the human body with tens of thousands of published research data. I don't know how you can malign a compound also. Can you just imagine? Poor little cholesterol.
Cholesterol has a horrendous reputation among the average person, for sure.
It has a horrible reputation for, but this is the same guy that I did something on cyanocobalamin, and he was like, he started screaming into the camera, the dosage determines the poison. The dosage determines the poison. Why would you worry about taking small doses of cyanocobalamin when the dosage determines the poison? I said, well, if you believe that the dosage really determines the poison, then I guess you believe in microdosing with mercury. I guess you believe that the fluoride levels that are in drinking water are safe because they're not enough to kill you or poison you at these certain levels. What we have to stop doing is we have to stop thinking about poisoning ourselves or taking microdoses of chemicals. And we have to start not talking about single dose toxicity, but talking about cumulative dose toxicity. Nobody ever got mercury poisoning from a single piece of tuna fish. They got mercury poisoning because they consistently ate mercury-laden tuna fish, and eventually the toxicity level built up and caused harm. You know, I was talking in particular here about cyanocobalamin, hydrogen cyanide-based B12. Can you go to Google while you're on here?
Don't lose our place in that video, though, because he goes on to talk specifically about the
size of
cholesterol
cholesterol?
size. Yeah,
Okay.
I would love to understand this better.
Yeah. We'll talk about particulate size and cholesterol. And then, so I was talking about this nutrient. I was like, if this is in your vitamins, throw it out and just find a vitamin that has methylcobalamin, a natural form of B12. So scroll down the section. By the way, we're on the National Library of Medicine at the National Institute of Health here. Scroll down to section 5.3. So there's the component compounds, right? It's made of the cobalt metal. And just click on hydrogen cyanide. So it's made from hydrogen cyanide. So this form of B12 is made from a flammable, acute, toxic, health hazard, environmental hazard. And if you scroll a little bit further down there and go to view more at the bottom.
It's interesting. So the argument here rests on whether the constant exposure to the chemical becomes a problem or not.
Yes, in the
Now,
micro exposure, it's just like fluoride. You know, we have certain amounts of fluoride in our water.
When I first started researching you sounded crazy to me when you were talking about fluoride, and I was like, uh-oh, tinfoil.
Yeah.
And then so I started looking into it. Like, are there a lot of people saying this, and I just haven't heard it? And there are a lot of people. Now, whether you guys are right or I have no idea.
Just Google fluoride poison study. The National Toxicology Program.
This is from the, okay.
Yeah. They did a systemic review of the scientific research on fluoride exposure. Can you blow it up?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can read this, then
And
whatever supplement you're on, I need.
Yeah. I'm 53. And neurodevelopmental and cognitive function, health effects in human, blah, 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 blah. Based on hazard classification, this study will actually talk about the inverse relationship in 3,200 municipalities. It will talk about the inverse relationship between fluoride and IQ, so that as fluoride actually went up, IQ actually went down.
Drinking water?
As fluoride in the drinking water went up, IQ went down. The National Toxicology Study actually looked at 3,200 water municipalities, and we know that fluoride is neurotoxic, but they looked at 3,200 municipalities. In these 3,200 municipalities, they found an inverse relationship between the amount of fluoride and IQ. Mm-hmm. So as the amount of fluoride in the drinking water per municipality went up, the IQ actually went down, especially in prepubescent teens. It talked especially about the incidence of IQ going down in prepubescent teens. I'll find it for you, and we'll link it to the podcast so we don't have to spend all the time. But I will find that report. I actually used it in one of my reports that I did, just a one-on-one with the camera. And again, I'm not trying to like sound the alarm, but if you have the possibility of filtering your water and not drinking fluoride in your water, and also chlorine and microplastics and pharmaceuticals, then for sure, tap water is one of the things I think that you should permanently get out of your life. Like, I also think you should permanently get genetically modified foods out of your life.
Yeah, that one.
Right?
All right, so we're definitely going to talk about these. Let's close the loop on cholesterol really fast.
On the cholesterol.
So
I would vehemently disagree with him, and I'd love to see the research that he's referring to.
Let's get specific.
So in the mortality space, and mortality is based on a pool of large data. Right. So when we would predict a life expectancy, it wouldn't be like if I predicted your life expectancy and it said, Tom, you had 272 months to live. It didn't mean in 272 months you would drop dead. It meant in 272 months you had an exact same chance of being alive as you did of being dead. It was the center of the bell curve, right? It was the median life expectancy. And then to move you to one side of the curve or to the other, we would look at specific risk factors. one of which was your LDL cholesterol over time. And this was based on a pool of 370 million lives. It is the largest population database in the world. So if you had low levels of triglyceride and slightly elevated LDL cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, this was a marker for longevity. If you had elevated triglyceride and low and high LDL, it was a marker for cardiovascular disease. So when you talk about markers for cardiovascular disease, you cannot look at LDL in a vacuum. It is not a linear correlation between increased LDL and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. That is absolutely patently false. If you have increased LDL cholesterol and you have increased levels of triglyceride, your mortality rate skyrockets. If you have increased levels of LDL cholesterol and low triglyceride, your incidence of cardiovascular disease plummets. So there is no linear correlation between LDL cholesterol on its own and cardiovascular disease. And that's
what
what I say.
You're saying that from an insurance predictive model perspective.
An insurance predictive model that was based on actual mortality.
Right.
So like we had data
one
that
thing
nobody
really
else
fast
had.
before you go down that, I want people to understand, because this is something that people seem to be very confused about, that you bring up a lot. So what people hear you say is that I can predict your, Tom Bilyeu, I can predict your death within a month, right?
Right.
Versus what you just said, which is, hopefully you can clip this out and play it around, that what you're actually saying is the models simply predict when you're going to hit the center of that. You're as likely to be alive as dead. This is statistical over a whole lot of people. This is not an individual's life. This is plugging in risk factors, figuring out what risk factors you have and where that would put you on this bell curve of alive or dead. And it's interesting because you've said something I heard Elon Musk say, which makes a lot of sense to me, which is, if you really want to know whether something matters or not, look at what the insurance companies do. And I think he was saying that in reference to whether the vaccines have any sort of impact on heart disease. And he was just like, watch what the insurance companies do. Now, I may be wrong about that. I want to be very clear. I don't want to misquote him.
Can
you
you
also
talking
about?
Sorry, can you also go to Fasano, Fasano and Associates? Just pull up that website. This is the largest life expectancy prediction company in the country. So this wasn't just work that I did. See how it says our specialties include life expectancies? Just go down, and it will show you that they do life expectancy predictions for annuities, for reverse mortgages, for life insurance. This is some of the most accurate science in the world. I mean, if you think about, and they actually put their the accuracy data for their life expectancies on here. How close to the median bell curve prediction were they? How far off of the standard deviation were they?
So they're publishing their data on, or making available, if you're a subscriber or however they monetize, they make those risk factor clusters known, and like, hey, if you smoke and you drink and you're sedentary, you're going to be dead at 63.
So when you look at life expectancy, and I'm glad we're actually going to get into this because I've never really had a chance to defend that. Like when I gave Dana White 10.4 years to live, and by the way, I've only done life expectancy for one person since I left that industry almost 9 years ago, and it was Dana White. I don't want to be known for being the guy that predicts life expectancy anymore. I don't even use that database any longer.
It's so emotionally powerful that while I get it's actually just a statistical proxy, I understand why the world has glommed onto this.
Yes.
And I think it behooves people. In fact, let me just do a PSA really fast. I think it behooves everybody, especially those people that I love, that know that they are living a lifestyle that is not good, to see, hey, if you do these behaviors, it's going to have this impact on your life. Now, why do I say this? As a guy who develops video games for a living, I'm telling you right now, anything that you can gamify, the reason I wear an Oura ring is it lets me gamify my sleep. I suddenly care because I can adjust my score, and it's fun.
So true.
And if you can, and Dana talked about this in the interview you did with him, he's like, oh, starting to feel better and knowing what my blood levels are that correlate to how I feel is fun. I like doing it. I like trying to optimize my blood. And so in business, they always say what gets measured gets improved.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good, even though it's just a statistical proxy. It is not your destiny. It is not saying that you actually are going to die this day in a car accident or from lung cancer or whatever.
Right.
It's just saying, hey, people that have these patterns statistically end up with this outcome. So it's good.
And by the way, it's very accurate. So I don't want to like downplay it either. You know, these life expectancies are extraordinarily accurate. If you look at, I mean, if you want to know how good life insurance companies are at predicting mortality, just look at what happened in the 2008-2009 financial services
what are their
crisis.
profit margins? Don't they have a legal obligation to pay out 91%?
Yeah, they have well, I mean, 98% of all life insurance never pays a death claim. 98% of all life insurance policies lapse. Only 2% of life insurance policies actually pay a death claim.
Whoa.
98% of all life insurance policies lapse.
Well, that's why they didn't go out of business.
Yeah, that's why they didn't.
People
go out
just
of
pay
business.
for a while and then stop.
Yeah. So when we had 364 banks fail, you didn't have one life insurance company fail. Not
That
one.
doesn't tell me that their data is good. It tells me that 98% of people lapse their policy and they're just raking in the money.
Well, where their data gets good is that the data that they have, which doesn't exist in other clinical studies or hospital chains or research foundations for universities, is that they know the day, the date, the time, the location, and the cause of death for 370 million lives, or maybe even more.
Basically,
and
AI. They've created an AI model that predicts how and when you're going to die.
And they can pull that in. And so there are what we call mortality factors, right? There are credits and there's debits. And then there's something called comorbidities, right? So you're on an actuarial curve, I'm on an actuarial curve, everybody in this room is on one, right?
How dare you?
How dare you?
I'm going to live forever, Gary. Didn't you know?
You can defy the odds, but you're on one, brother. So it's like,
Yes.
okay, you're a 37-year-old male, you have a life expectancy of X, so bang. But the life insurance company doesn't care where you are on an actuarial curve, right? They want your specific mortality before they put $50 million or $75 million worth of risk on your life. Because if they do, only one thing matters.
Do they DNA
Right.
test?
They do now.
Oof,
Yeah.
that's a little scary.
Yeah, they do now.
Do I love that or do I hate that? As an entrepreneur, I love it because it means that you can get better. As a person that may want a life insurance policy at some point, I hate it. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was allowed, you know, in that underwriting department, you could get a blood test once, but pretty much any blood marker that you wanted. So if you wanted to see if their chances of something that was chronic becoming non-chronic, or you wanted to, for example, you know, we would see vast amount of misdiagnosis in medical records. And that's what I did. I didn't get my knowledge even from the 8 years of undergrad and grad school I went to. I went to undergraduate for biology. I went to grad school for human biology. So I have another 4-year degree in human biology, where I really got the majority of my knowledge was from reading medical records 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week for almost 20 years. All I did was do medical record extraction. When you start reading that voluminous amount of medical records, you start to see how the practice of medicine is done, and you start to see the patterns in the practice of medicine, and you start to see the downside because you see the number of misdiagnoses that are going on, where patients that have simple nutrient deficiencies like vitamin D3 are diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, put on a corticosteroid, which eats their joints over the next 6 years, causes them to have a joint replacement, and then reduces their mobility, what we call your ambulatory profile, and then brings in all of the diseases from further down your future that exacerbate with reduced mobility. And you find that so many of these things, methotrexate that they put people on for you know, arthritic conditions, which gives you an MTHFR gene mutation that you didn't have, shuts down the ability for your body to use folate and turn it into methylfolate, creating this massive deficiency. And initially it's put into your body to be anti-inflammatory, but now it actually shuts your gut down, disrupts your mood, you know, begins to cause contents in your gut to putrefy. And you develop not only gut issues, which is the primary result of these pharmaceuticals, but you also start to get mood disorders and personality alterations because you now are creating a deficiency in the body that you didn't otherwise create. The same thing, by the way, we would see in cholesterol statin medications. Prolonged use of statins suppressing cholesterol, which is a construction material, not a fuel source. It is a construction material that we use to make every cell wall, every cell membrane, and every hormone in the human body. When we start to deplete these fuel sources, you would begin to see significant hormone disruption and other consequences down the line of over suppressing cholesterol in the body. You see the same thing in psychiatric medications. The studies are being published now that we actually saw the damage from during my career, and that is that, we knew that people that were on antidepressants for prolonged periods of time had significantly higher rates of suicide, and nobody was talking about it. They had significantly more severe depression when they got off. They reported massive, what they would call crushing depression after prolonged use of antidepressants. And prolonged use of antidepressants, they would start to go into their primary care and their psychiatrist and complain that they were actually starting to have suicidal thoughts that were leading them to certain actions. And you would see this in the medical record because the patient history would be in there. And so you saw this voluminous amount of not just medical misdiagnosis, but this voluminous amount of modifiable risk factors that were in the mortality prediction. So you put somebody onto a bell curve, and now we're trying to decide, are they going to die earlier than their average population, or are they going to die later than their average population? And so you start to take away what's called mortality debits. They have diabetes, they're hypertensive, they're morbidly obese. And each one of those would give you a debit. But if you had all three of those in the same biome, they would get a massive debit, because being morbidly obese, type 2 diabetic, and hypertensive in the same body is way worse than having any one of those conditions on their own. So these were called comorbidities, and they would dramatically accelerate your rate of death, right? They would move you way to the left of the bell curve. And what was astounding was that the majority of these factors that were moving people from the center of the bell curve, of the mortality curve, to the left, meaning they were going to die earlier. This was called the mortality multiplier, the statistical chance that they would die before the mean, right? This is called the mortality multiplier. What was moving people to the left were modifiable risk factors, meaning had I just been able to get on the phone and contact that person, I could have made a dramatic change in
What are
their
the
life.
standard ones? Smoking, being sedentary, loss of muscle mass.
Smoking, being sedentary, loss of muscle mass. I mean, there, clearly sarcopenia, age-related muscle wasting, which is why you hear a lot of people say, if you want to live a long time, lift heavy weight. That's actually very, very true. But things like, like you would see anemia, for example.
Is this a super common one?
Super common. People are anemic. And why are they anemic?
As they're getting older?
Yes, as they're getting older, but it's getting into younger and younger ages. In people in their early 50s, late 40s, mid 40s are having hormone imbalance. And why are they having hormone imbalances? Not because their hormones are necessarily, their testicles, for example, have lost the ability to secrete testosterone, but because they have deficiencies in things like DHEA and vitamin D3.
The building blocks of
the building
testosterone.
blocks, right? Like, remember we talked about earlier that we said, a lot of reasons why people will come into one of our clinics, right? And is they'll say, I'm low on energy. So when somebody says I'm low on energy, we just convert that to physiology. If you tell me you're low on energy, what you're really saying is I'm low on oxygen, right? And so if you're low on oxygen, one of the consequences, one of the causes of being low on oxygen is being low on red blood cells and being low on hemoglobin, right? Not anemic, but this hides in plain sight, right? Because a red blood cell carries oxygen inside of a fluid called hemoglobin. So when your red blood cell count is in the lower quartile, but it's still normal, and your hemoglobin is in the lower quartile, but it's still normal, this starts to compound, meaning it starts to reduce the oxidative state in the blood. You're carrying less oxygen. Well, if you go to the place in the body where red blood cells and hemoglobin are made, it's the bone marrow, right? So how do I get the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, which would raise my energy level? You go to the boss of the bone marrow, which is the hormone testosterone. If you look at
In men and women, one of the primary roles of testosterone is erythropoiesis, to put pressure on the bone marrow to create new red blood cells. This is why very often when men start hormone therapy, testosterone injections, they have to do regular blood donations, right? Because the bone marrow spits out so many red blood cells that the blood begins to thicken. It raises something called their hematocrit level. It raises their blood viscosity. So I would see in the medical record, man, this person is basically walking around anemic in plain sight. Their red blood cell count is right in the bottom quartile or bottom 10 percentile. Their hemoglobin level is super, super low. They're low on the hormone testosterone. They have no DHEA. They have no vitamin D3, and they're exhausted. And when they're exhausted, they also can't sleep.
And as soon as the exhaustion would affect the sleep, then we would start to increase the rate of the debits. Because why is it that people that are the most exhausted sleep the worst? You know, when you ask a doctor, why is it that most people, the people that are the most exhausted sleep the worst? Because you would think it would be the opposite, right? You would think that people that are really exhausted, the one thing they would do really well is sleep. But the truth is, it's because they're both related to blood oxygen. Why are you tired? Because you're low on blood oxygen. Well, what happens when you lay down to go to bed at night? Your respiratory rate starts to fall. As your respiration rate starts to fall, the amount of oxygen coming into your blood starts to drop. Eventually, the amount of blood oxygen gets to a critical level as you're going into a delta wave of sleep. And as you start to go into that delta wave of sleep, your brain panics and it wakes you up. How does it wake you up? It pulses cortisol, right? So if you actually look at the aura ring of somebody that has low blood oxygen, you'll see that they look like a bouncing rubber ball going down the hallway at night.
Between what modes? Light sleep and deep
Between
sleep?
delta and alpha beta. And I'm not
I don't
talking
know how to
about,
read an aura ring in those ways.
Okay,
it just
so
says light,
between light
deep,
sleep
wake.
and deep sleep.
Okay.
So deep sleep, they'll bounce off the
What
ground.
should it look like? Should it look like you go light, deep, stay deep, light, wake?
Yes. I mean,
I'm a bouncing
ideally,
ball
what
then.
you would look like is you fell off a cliff, and you laid at the bottom of the cliff for a while, and then you pop back out.
That is not what mine looks like. I worry that mine looks like the bouncing ball you're describing.
'Cause your
not I
mind is
worry. So
waking you up.
I bounce back and forth between light. So mine will go fall asleep fast. I'll go light for pretty brief, then deep, but then I'll pop back up to light, then deep.
Yep.
Then I'll go light, wake, then light, deep, light, and then wake.
Yeah, so it
That's
looks like
my
it's
typical,
blue, and then it gets white, and then it goes back down. It looks like
typically
broken
only
teeth,
hit,
kind of.
Yes, I only hit white usually once to twice a night, but I bounce back and forth between light and deep.
So what's happening there? So yours isn't happening because you're exhausted, but you know when people are, this is why people that go on hormone therapy sometimes feel so good, right? Because what happens is when we normalize the level or optimize the level of testosterone, and if you actually want to look at the studies on this, you can go to the 2018 Journal of American Urology. So you see here that clinicians. So this is according to this is the Bible, by the way.
All right,
male
let me just read
endocrine
this.
therapy.
Clinicians should inform testosterone deficient patients that low testosterone is a risk factor for cardiovascular
Is a
disease.
risk factor for cardiovascular disease, not the other way
Strong
around.
evidence.
There is strong evidence. So in other words, if I'm your doctor, and for the record, I'm not a doctor, I'm a human biologist, but if I'm your doctor and you're low on testosterone, what should I inform you will happen if you get on hormone therapy? Well, first I should.
I always thought I wanted to leave my testosterone alone as long as humanly possible.
You do. This is why
Sort of. I want to get it up if it's low.
you want to get it up if it's low by giving your body the raw material to make it on its own. So you want to look
Facts.
at your DHEA level, your vitamin D3 level, and you want to look at a very specific protein
How
in
do I
the
get
blood.
DHEA?
Just pull DHEA on your blood.
No, how do I eat it? How do I consume it?
Well, you know, the best way is to supplement with it, but you can get dihydroepiandrosterone from certain cruciferous vegetables, but
100,000 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to supplement. So what would I do? Chew on the bark of a tree,
cruciferous,
eat
cruciferous
grass.
vegetables.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's
We're gonna have to go
but,
into
you know,
carnivore versus vegan at some point here.
Yeah, I mean that's I'm ready. Are you a vegan?
No.
Oh, okay,
No, no, no.
'cause
But
we'll
I
have a
have
heck
no
of a debate on
philosophical
that.
thing. I just want what's effective.
Carnivore is very effective.
But you just said to eat cruciferous vegetables to avoid low testosterone.
Yeah, but you could also eat grass-fed meats. I mean, grass-fed meats, and I'll give you a whole. We can talk about grass-fed meats, eggs, raw dairy, pasture-raised chickens, pasture-raised eggs. Again, the problem is it's not the meat. It's the industrial processed meat. I mean, grass-fed meat is excellent for you. So are pasture-raised eggs. In fact, the only thing of any consequence when you're buying eggs is that they should be pasture-raised, not that they're cage-free, because that just means that chicken's out of the cage when they feed
You
them a
want them
bunch of
eating
shit.
worms and bugs. And
You want them eating worms, bugs, in grass. I mean, just like when a cow eats grass, it doesn't just eat the grass. It actually gets soil. It actually gets minerals, zinc, magnesium, nutrients from the soil. But if you see here, patients should be informed that testosterone therapy may result in improvements in erectile function, low sex drive, anemia, bone mineral density, lean body mass, and or depressive symptoms.
Are you tracking Brian Johnson at all?
Yes.
So he's all
Blueprint.
about his erection, rejuvenation. I actually don't know his protocol. Do you know, what is he doing? Is it a testosterone enhancing
so the thing
protocol?
that he does that I'm really a big fan of, and I won't say that I understand everything that's going on in his blueprint. I actually did a Piers Morgan show about him the other day because they were like, "Oh, he's a complete charlatan." I go, "He's not a
Brian
charlatan."
Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, this was like Lord Winston, who was on this program from the UK. Do you remember Lord Winston? He was so fun. I mean, the guy looked like he was actually about to have a stroke. So
I was going to say, like, unless
and
this
Brian
guy
Johnson
is
looks like
shredded,
he's 18. I mean,
Yeah.
shredded. He looks great. I think
look
what
like
he's
an
doing is
elf
amazing
in real life.
because what he's done reminds me of you in some ways. Now that
I
I'm getting
wish.
to know you.
He's like aging backwards.
Well, not in that sense, but the discipline, because what he's done, the major thing that he's accomplished, which I think you could probably do too, is he has removed himself entirely from the equation. He does not make any decisions. What he eats, what he supplements with, what he drinks, the amount of fluid he intakes, everything is based on data. So he doesn't eat when he feels like eating. He doesn't eat in a particular window. He doesn't eat a particular food, although his is vegan based, but or plant based. But the amount of protein, carbohydrates, all of his macros, his micros, every supplement that he has competes for its life in testing. So he's looking at his hemoglobin A1C, his glycemic profile, his nutrient deficiencies, his hormone balance, and then essentially his exercise and his diet and his hydration are specifically tailored to specific biomarkers. So he is constantly tapping those biomarkers. Now, I don't know how much imaging he's doing because obviously too much imaging is actually really bad for you. But I know that he does DEXA scans, and I know that he does MRIs, and he does other types of imaging to look at body mass index and specifically visceral and body fat and ratios of brown fat to white fat. I think what he's doing is he's proving what is possible. Nobody is going to say, I'm going to be that psycho-disciplined.
I won't say nobody. Right. So Brian Johnson is a glimpse 7 years from now into the future where you have a CGM type device that you put on the back of your arm and it feeds data to your AI that if I have anything to do with it, you'll have an interface with.
Right.
And that AI will have personality and it will tell you, you should eat now and you should eat these exact things. And don't worry, I've told the fridge to order whatever, right. And it's going to be there and ready for you. And based on your blood, you should be eating this, drinking this. That I cannot stress enough. That is not science fiction. That will happen, barring World War III that sends us all back into the Stone Age.
Right.
That's going to happen.
Oh, I believe that. But I'm saying when you look at the practical nature of, okay, travel, like you just said, I went to London, I went to Dubai, I came from Dubai back to LA. That sort of thing makes it hard. When you're in your home environment and you have this AI that is feeding you the exact meals. Now, maybe when you travel, it can tell you exactly what to eat and where to eat and maybe locate the restaurant for you, something like that. But practically to do what he's doing, even if you had AI figuring it all out for you while you're here in your own home and you have access to those certain nutrients, but when you're living your life, it's going to be hard, I think, to do that, AI or not.
I think most people won't even be able to do it in their home. That's the more terrifying part. But it is very exciting to me as a person that has that kind of discipline to know that data is racing its way towards us. He's the bleeding edge for sure. And even I'm not going to spend $2 million a year on it.
Right.
I would have to be guaranteed that it would have the outcome that I want. There's too many question marks right now. But so anyway, going back to testosterone predictor, and this was nested inside of the larger prediction engine.
So let's go back to, so now we talked about red blood cell and hemoglobin were low. We looked at the hormone levels. So let's say the testosterone is low because we went to the bone marrow and we said, okay, the bone marrow is not making enough red blood cells and making enough hemoglobin. Why not? Well, now we look at the hormone testosterone. Testosterone is low. It's one of its primary roles is erythropoiesis, putting pressure on the bone marrow. So now the question is, don't just replace the hormone. Why is testosterone low? Well, the next thing I would look at would be 3 factors. I would look at your DHEA level, your vitamin D.
Cruciferous vegetables or grass-fed beef.
Mm-hmm. Grass-fed beef. My preference would be grass-fed beef and grass-fed beef, chicken, eggs, raw dairy, but non-pasteurized, non-homogenized, raw A2 dairy. And then And then you take it a step lower. There's a protein in the blood called SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. And this protein, when it rises, it actually does exactly what its name sounds like, and it binds to sex hormones, primarily testosterone, and it will lower the level of free testosterone in your blood. So again, very often what happens is nutrient deficiencies drive deficiencies in things like hormones. Deficiencies in hormone drive deficiencies in bone marrow production of red blood cell and hemoglobin, which drive deficiencies in oxygen, which essentially lead to the deficiency in energy, which is exactly why you see these kinds of comments in the Journal of American Urology, which again, I would consider one of the Bibles for male endocrine therapy, that things like fatigue, the risk factor for cardiovascular disease, even the implication that hormone therapy could increase the incidence of thrombolytic events, strokes, heart attacks, cardiovascular risk. That's all been debunked here. And they actually cite the evidence for that. And I don't think that there's a practicing physician today that wouldn't say that the Journal of American Urology is one of the Bibles for male endocrine therapy. So just back to this data for a moment. So now people that are deficient in vitamin D3, deficient in DHEA, and have this excess protein called SHBG, these are not massive, these are not diseases, these are not pathologies, these are nutrients in the human body, very simple to fix. What is the consequence? The consequence is low hormones, low red blood cell count, low hemoglobin. What's the consequence of that? Very poor sleep, very poor energy, poor focus and concentration, poor short-term recall, weight gain, water retention, a very poor response to exercise, slow recovery. So you have all this myriad of things that are coming from pretty simple nutrient deficiencies. And again, we would see this in the medical record. I'm like, well, this person doesn't really need hormone therapy. They just need DHEA and vitamin D3. This person doesn't need to be given injections of testosterone. They need to get this protein lowered. So we don't study human beings the same way that we study plants. We don't say, well, let's add nitrogen to the soil and let the tree rebound. We just say, well, the disease is in the leaf, so let's replace the leaf or cut it off. And the same thing happens take vitamin D3 deficiency. It compromises the immune system. You get repeated viral infections. You get repeated bacterial infections, which further compromise the immune system, because a lot of viral pathogens in the human body are opportunistic, right? Like Epstein-Barr virus. You don't catch Epstein-Barr virus. You always had it. It was mono that you had as a child that came back in your 40s as Epstein-Barr because you ran the immune system down. Chicken pox that you had as a child comes back as shingles. You didn't actually catch shingles. You've always had it. So now all of a sudden you're starting to have a compromised immune system because of a compromised nutrient deficiency. And because of this compromised immune system, you're getting repeated viral infections. And now you're taking either repeated antivirals or repeated antibiotics, which is now destroying the gut. So again, my whole point is that we should come full circle back to the human body and say, first, what nutrient deficiency could be causing this consequence, right? Because if you take the majority of people with low testosterone that are also clinically deficient in DHEA and vitamin D3, and I have thousands of patient records to prove this. I'm more than 20. How many clinicians do we have working for us now? 22. We have 22 full-time licensed clinicians that work for me full-time. And you go back into their record and you look at what happens when we just put D3 and DHEA into their bodies. That's it. Just gave them vitamin D3 back into the optimal range, gave them DHEA back into the optimal range. Their hormone levels returned to normal. Their red blood cell count and hemoglobin rose into the optimal range. And the consequence for them was better focus, better concentration, improved sleep, and improved waking energy. Not hormone therapy, not fancy sleeping pills, no chemicals, no synthetics, no pharmaceuticals, just the deficiency that was missing from the body that was causing it to not behave optimally.
Okay, so thinking about all of this through the lens of wanting people to want to know where on the actuarial curve they fall, what their predicted mortality is. You talk about two separate things, but I rarely hear you bring them together. So okay. You've got protocols, sleep, red light, earthing, all that. And then you've got nutrient deficiency. Help me bring them together.
Okay.
Does this database that unfortunately is never going to see the light of day that you've said would just absolutely destroy medicine? I forget the words you use.
It would just upend modern medicine in a way that would be catastrophic.
Because when you say catastrophic, you mean it would end that industry because people would realize drugs don't solve it?
Yes. You would realize the true consequences of a lot of the pharmaceuticals that are out there right now.
Got it.
The true consequence of mRNA vaccines and the additional production of spike proteins. You'd see the true consequence, the genesis of what happens with long-term statin use. You'd see the inappropriate use of a lot of beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, and diuretics, which are actually targeting the heart when the heart isn't the issue, it's the vascular system. You'd see the consequences of long-term use of things like levothyroxine and Synthroid that are pounding on perfectly healthy organs for crimes that they're not committing, because the issue is actually methylation of thyroid hormones outside of the thyroid, not the actual thyroid itself. I mean, if you want to talk about a pandemic in this country, we have a pandemic of medicating organs for crimes that they didn't commit.
And we are doing that because we have a system that has a pill for every ill. We're not looking for root cause analysis. We are addressing the symptom rather than the cause.
We're addressing, because in symptom management, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry. In disease prevention, there is no multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, look at type 2 diabetes. It's a $110 billion annual industry. Do you think there are meetings going on somewhere in Big Pharma right now to say, hey, let's find a way to put that out of business? It's a $110 billion annual industry. The SSRI business, the opiate business, the business of, and I'm not just saying that these do not have a specific place, nor am I saying that there's this sinister motive to try to kill everybody. But what I'm saying is, we don't look at human beings with the thought that this body could heal itself if it had the raw material to do its job. Look at the number of people that are on hypothyroid medication. Well, if you look at the thyroid production of thyroid hormones, the thyroid produces all of the thyroid hormone T4, but it only produces 20% of the thyroid hormone T3. Yet we use thyroid hormone T3 to diagnose hypothyroid. Well, if people are low on thyroid T3, there's an 80% chance it's not the thyroid. But what do? In 100% of the cases, almost, we medicate the thyroid. We're holding the thyroid responsible for a crime it's not committing. So the question is, where does the other 80% of the thyroid come from? It is methylated in the gut. We take thyroid hormone T4 and we methylate it into thyroid hormone T3. So why don't we look to the gut to put the nutrients into the gut to start converting thyroid hormones before we start standing on the thyroid synthetically?
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
If 85% of all hypertension diagnosis, people with hypertension, high blood pressure, are diagnosed with idiopathic hypertension, or what we call primary or essential hypertension, they all mean the same thing. If 85% of these are of unknown origin, then why don't we start looking for the origin in certain nutrient deficiencies? Why don't we actually look to see if the vascular system is overconstricted because of homocysteine? When we start to look at rheumatoid arthritis, why are we not doing specific test set rates and RA factors to determine whether or not somebody has this autoimmune condition, versus just taking the symptoms that they have and putting them on something like a corticosteroid? And I could go on and on and on. I'm not saying that these medications don't have their place. They are just so dramatically overused because we have lost faith in the body's ability to heal itself, and we don't go hunting for nutrient deficiencies. And so let's put all of these tests together, like you said. You know, I do a genetic test on people, or my clinics do genetic tests. You don't have to get the genetic test through me, but there are plenty of really, really good genetic tests. But there is a genetic methylation test I think every human being should do once in their lifetime. Why? Because you only have to do the test once. You do that test once, you will never guess again on what your body can convert and what it can't. And then you can supplement for deficiency. See, your aversion to supplementing is rightfully found because you would be supplementing just for the sake of supplementing. If you just started taking a bunch of great supplements, but if you knew that your body couldn't convert a certain nutrient into the usable form, you should be a lot more comfortable supplementing with just that nutrient. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying take a bunch of supplements off the shelf and just start shoveling them in. I'm saying get data, do a genetic test, supplement for deficiency, and then use your blood work to track whether or not that's working. And in the blood work, there's about 74 biomarkers that I look at. There's plenty of clinics that look at the same biomarkers. They are not germane to me, nor do I do anything incredibly special with those biomarkers. But I look at glycemic control, how well you control your blood sugar, which we talked about, hormone balance, which is extraordinarily important, and nutrient deficiencies, things like D3, B12, and nutrient deficiencies. If you look at those three categories, I mean, there would be a massive shift in systemic pathology and disease in this country if people would supplement for deficiency and monitor those three areas of their blood work. That's the simple part. And then, of course, there's all kinds of fancy biohacking things that you can do, but for zero, you can do breath work, expose your skin to sunlight, touch the surface of the earth, and take a cold shower. There's not a person listening to this podcast, no matter what their budget is, that couldn't add those four things to their daily routine, and it would change the entire trajectory of their life. Right? Yes, my clinic manufactures and we sell very expensive red light therapy beds and PEMF and oxygen. And if you have the budget to purchase those things to make life convenient, great. But it is not a necessary part of you becoming an ultimate human or becoming optimally healthy. You can do all of that on a very, very little budget. And then shifts in our diet don't actually have to be shifts in the things that we like to eat. You know, I do these things with clients all the time called lateral shifts. You know, we'll go to their refrigerator and I'll say, okay, let's open up your refrigerator. You show me what you like to eat. Oh, you like this yogurt with fruit on the bottom, this Dannon yogurt with fruit on the bottom. Okay, this has high fructose corn syrup, and it's got 54 grams of sugar. Whoa. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take whole fat Greek yogurt. You like the blueberry flavor? Okay, we're going to get organic blueberries, and then we're going to use monk fruit. And you're going to take a scoop of, a couple tablespoons of whole fat Greek yogurt. You're going to take a fistful of blueberries, and you're going to take a teaspoon of monk fruit and mix it up. And you tell me if you can tell the difference between those two, which you can't. And this one has an entirely different nutritional profile than this one does, with the corn syrup and the fake fruit and no fats and virtually no protein. And it's all high glycemic carbohydrates. This one has healthy fats, is low carbohydrate, high amounts of protein, and still tastes exactly the same. And this is not a massive shift in your budget. It's just a shift in your awareness of what you're eating. Get things like seed oils out of your diet, genetically modified foods, because the evidence on genetically modified foods now is terrible, that it may actually even be altering our own genome, right? It may actually, these genetically modified organisms may actually be negatively impacting our own DNA, altering our own DNA.
So I have a quote from you. The worst thing to ever happen to us was genetically modified foods.
I think it's one of them.
Why?
Because we are making non-foods out of foods, and we are doing an experiment on humanity, right? When we start genetically modifying organisms in non-naturopathic ways, we don't know what the long-term consequences are in the human body. So if you look at the research in 2009, and again, I will post this sequence of articles, 2009, 2013, 2023. I'll show you in 2009 how the research, the meta-analyses that were going on genetically modified foods in 2009, because of their lack of prevalence, was mainly in animal studies and anecdotal correlations to human beings, meaning this may have a detrimental effect. It does appear to be causing certain anomalies in rats and mice. By 2013, they were like, there is significant evidence in animal studies that genetically modified foods are having a negative impact on our physiology, specifically liver and hepatic toxicity, mental function, early onset of things like Alzheimer's and dementia, specifically the neurofibrillary tangles. By the time you get to 2023, and we actually had human clinical trials, I mean, there is direct evidence that genetically modified foods are not only potentially modifying our DNA, but are actually creating conditions in the human body that are making us less resistant to antibiotics.
How would it modify our DNA?
The same way that when you put synthetic messenger RNA, like look at what we did with vaccines, right? We used to use something called an attenuated virus, where we take the nucleocapsid protein of a virus and it had the DNA inside the envelope, and we would basically take the DNA out, or we render the DNA. We would kill the DNA. Mm-hmm. So now you put this viral envelope into your body, and your immune system still sees this viral envelope and it manufactures an antibody. But without the DNA, it couldn't affect you, right? So this is an attenuated virus. And then all of a sudden we started to use messenger RNA. Well, what is an mRNA vaccine? Well, an mRNA vaccine is taking a synthetic copy of a message from your DNA and putting a synthetic message into your body, not created by your DNA, not sent from the nucleus of your cell, but synthetically derived. And that message gets into your cell and it never shuts off. Remember, DNA has two major roles, right? If you look inside the nucleus of the cell, you've got the DNA, the boss, right? It has two major roles. One is replication. It creates an exact copy of itself. The other one is transcription, where it's writing messages into the cytoplasm of the cell, right? You throw this nutrient out, you bring this nutrient in, you make this protein. Well, those messages are called mRNA. So if you take one of those messages and you synthetically recreate it, right? A normal mRNA lasts 2 to maybe 12 hours. A synthetic message may not ever break down. So now, if you're a minion in the cell and I'm the DNA and I write you a message and I say, go make this protein, Tom, and you go make the protein, you come back to the desk and I go make the protein. You come back to the desk, go make the protein, come back, go make the protein. Normally that message wouldn't be on your desk when you got back from completing that task. When it's a synthetic mRNA, that message never degrades. You keep making the protein.
Would it not die with the cell?
Not if it's synthetic. It will go into the next cell, because remember, part of the cell's life cycle through mitosis and meiosis is to duplicate, right? So it can pass on synthetic messenger RNA. If it passed on organic messenger RNA, then yes, that message would degrade. But when you pass on a synthetic message from cytoplasm to cytoplasm, it doesn't degrade in the next generation. So now the next generation starts picking up that message. Then it divides again, and the next generation starts picking up that message. Now, I don't profess to be an expert in mRNA vaccines, but I know enough about human physiology to say if you make a synthetic copy of the message from the DNA that doesn't degrade, and the protein sequence never shuts off, we keep making all of this spike protein, and that leaves the cell and it enters the serum of the blood, and then it beds itself into the arterial wall, and you start to get reduced, you start to impair the blood-brain barrier so that nutrients in the blood can't leave the blood and enter the tissue, and contents from the tissue, waste can't be eliminated from the tissue back into the blood. Now you get this whole strange myriad of symptoms. Right, you look at the scans on these people, they have something called diffuse vasculitis or dystonia.
Who are these people?
People that have been vaccinated and multiple boosted with mRNA that have high amounts of spike protein in their bloods, in their arterial wall. You can see something called diffuse vasculitis or dystonia vasculitis, where you have an inflammation in the lining of the blood vessel. Right, and you have 63,000 miles of blood vessel in your body. If you start interrupting that blood-brain barrier, just think of contents in the blood that can't reach the tissue, and waste from the tissue that can't get back into the blood. And so that's with messenger RNA. I think one of the worst things to happen to us was genetically modified foods. Some of the nutritional content that we find in genetically modified foods is exactly just that. It is the macros in the GMO wheat. But when you actually look at the absorption rate of the macros, it's virtually zero. So now we're making genetically modified food that the body doesn't recognize as food, and it can't draw any nutrients from it. So eating is not about just being full. Eating is about actually being able to have bioavailable nutrients.
I'm having a hard time tracking something here. So the mRNA thing I understood as a standalone item, though I don't get why a synthetic version doesn't degrade, but we'll set aside that for a second.
Because it's synthetic.
I don't know why that would inherently mean that it doesn't degrade. Given the limited thing that I know about cells and instructions in cells, you've got the instructions are being read off and it does whatever the instructions tell it to do. But if that cell gets flagged for deletion because it's senescent, because its telomeres have gotten short and so it's on self-destruct mode, I don't understand how or why, unless that cell inside of it, and I'm a lay person, I want to be very clear about that.
Yeah.
But why that cancer cells are cells that no longer listen to instructions. So the way I'm understanding what you're saying is that this has a, like a cancer cell that refuses to die or be told to stop producing, replicating, whatever. I guess you're not saying that it continues to replicate, it continues to produce spike protein, but it's not dying. I don't understand
it continues,
what in the mess, because all of this has to be a set of instructions, right?
Yes, and it's a set of instructions. It's not producing the spike protein. It's the message to produce the spike protein.
Correct.
So when you look at a cell, when it goes through what's called mitosis, where it actually creates a perfect copy of itself.
Yes.
As it goes from being a one cell into mitotically dividing into two cells, it's not just the organic matter that would divide, it would be the inorganic messenger RNA that would also pass into that new cell.
But it self divides? Or are you saying that one single thing just keeps moving with the cell?
Continues to move.
Got it. What is it about that stops itself from being terminated?
Because it's synthetic. It's not a
Get
biodegradable.
into,
like, think about a piece of plastic, right? For example,
but a piece of plastic is going to have an organic structure that has a reason why it can't be broken down unless you create a certain bacteria or whatever that's designed to break that thing down. So that I understand. It comes down to the physical
you ever heard
structure.
Of forever chemicals? Like they say, there's certain forever chemicals.
Yes.
Like, okay, so a forever chemical is one that gets into the body that the body doesn't recognize. It can't metabolize. It can't break it down, turn it into waste, and get rid of it because it doesn't have an enzyme or a mechanism to break it down. So synthetic mRNA is no different. It's synthetic. So it's not like an organic messenger that comes from an organic strand of DNA. It's a synthetic strand. So there's no enzyme, there's no mechanism for it to actually biodegrade.
What is the mechanism that's on a normal cell that's missing from mRNA?
It's an organic message. So it delivers the message and then it is enzymatically dissolved. The body actually breaks that message down. So
I don't understand this well enough to know the silver bullet question to ask, but what I hear, what it sounds like is you don't know the mechanism of action. Because what I'm trying to understand is, okay, a normal cell, how is it destroyed?
Yeah.
And then normal RNA, how is it destroyed? And then what is it about this synthetic mRNA that is absent or cloaked or whatever that blocks it?
So what would happen is normally messenger RNA would leave the nucleus of the cell. An mRNA message would leave the nucleus of the cell, and it would deliver an
the mRNA message, the RNA message, or the
RNA message. So
that's different than the thing, the actual RNA itself.
Right. So the ribonucleic acid from the DNA. It reads a message from the DNA. That ribonucleic acid departs, and it's called, there's a little M in front of ribonucleic acid because it's a message. So this ribonucleic acid leaves the nucleus of the cell. It enters the cytoplasm of the cell, and it gives an instruction to an organelle in the cell. Call it the endoplasmic reticulum. That instruction is a sequence. It's usually an amino acid nucleotide sequence. So when those amino acid nucleotides depart, they now cause an action, the creation of a protein. This is now dissolved. I mean, the
That's the part where I'm not. So I'm tracking.
so-
all that makes sense.
so the amino acids-
mRNA at that moment, the normal one, the non-synthetic, the organic one,
has
it has a
essentially
self-destruct mechanism.
it's given its life to that message. It's made up of a sequence of nucleotides. Then the nucleotides go out. They
Why
bind
doesn't that happen with the synthetic mRNA?
because it is synthetic. So it's a pretend copy of these. It's the same
there's gotta be a
nucleotide
reason.
sequence.
So, is it fair to say you don't know the mechanism of action? So
I don't know why specifically why the body doesn't break it down, other than it doesn't have the enzymatic capacity to break it down.
So there's something about the structure of this mRNA
There's something
that the
about
body
the
doesn't
synthetic
recognize.
chemical
I need to break this
structure
down
of-
because you're
of
saying
this
the other one
mRNA.
gives its life. I'm just trying to figure out why this one doesn't give its life. Anyway, this feels like a dead end. Okay, so we will round it to
Okay.
that at least as of right now, because I'm guessing there are not a lot of studies on this, certainly not longitudinal. That's the whole beef that people that are upset with the non-safety checks and balances with Operation Warp Speed. So we don't know.
Here's what we should be asking for. Is there a study showing when synthetic mRNA is no longer detectable in the body?
Yes.
That would
great
answer
question. But that study
not
does
aware
not
of that.
exist. Right. Okay. Now we got onto that tangent from why GMOs are horrible. So that the statement that it may edit our DNA makes the prediction that we're absorbing something that has a virus-like quality. What is it about? What GMOs specifically have a virus-like quality? I've never heard that before, only because I'm woefully uneducated on GMOs, I will say.
I don't remember the specific study that but what I will commit to do is put that study into, I'll give that study to you and I'll put it into, because this is very recent evidence. This was a 2023 article, clinical study that I read on genetically modified foods that essentially said that there is evidence now that certain genetically modified foods, these sequences are having a negative impact on our DNA, meaning that they're actually affecting the way that DNA replication is working.
Because I have not delved deeply into this, I have base assumptions that may be wildly inaccurate. With that disclosure, I will just tell you where my current map of this situation is right now. That our ability to produce enough food that is resilient to weather, pesticides, all of that.
Glyphosates is really
The way that we're able to feed the globe on as little real estate as we have is through the ingenuity that we've shown through genetically modifying the crops to be either a more to have higher nutrient value, or
they're
to
not really. I'd love to see where they're genetically modifying them to increase nutrient.
Well, first, let me just give you my map.
or yield.
I'll just give you, because that was going to be my next one. I'll give you my map. This could all be wrong.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to lay out the assumptions that I have currently as a layperson, so that I can find the edges of my map onto how this could be getting in and editing people's DNA. So one, with the base assumption that I have that we would not be able to support the current population with non-GMO foods, which again could be wrong, I'm immediately going to be like, whoa, we need to look very closely at this. Now, I'm well aware that like Europe is super skeptical. I think Russia has like outlawed
I think it's even
GMOs.
a felony in Russia.
So for
GMO
sure,
foods.
there are people that are like, hey, this is like absolutely terrible, 100%.
I
so
think
I get
Italy
that.
too. They just outlaw lab-grown meats.
Now, having said that, I'm well aware that all just may be ignorance on my part, but we have modified foods, in my understanding, not because we're trying to send in a virus-like thing that can be absorbed by the gut and then actually remains active despite digestion, which
I don't think so
have
either.
a hard time wrapping my head
I don't
around.
think that it's a sinister origin that we're
No,
genetically
I don't think they do it on
modifying.
purpose.
Yeah.
I just don't even understand how a food can be metabolized by my microbes in my gut, cross the epithelial lining, get into my bloodstream in a way that, like a virus, then goes in and actually snips the code of my DNA the way that either a virus would do, or I think it's, do we sometimes do that with bacteria? CRISPR-Cas9, is that virus or bacteria?
Yeah, but CRISPR is actually physical. I mean, it's
That's the only way to edit
Yeah.
DNA, right? It would have to be going in and snipping
yeah,
or unless it's epigenetic
and
it's-
snip it, or could be a chemical influence. I mean, a lot of chemicals are not necessarily snipping the DNA, but what they're doing is they're blocking the binding sequences. So, if you look at the cytosine, glycine sequences, or the sequences that actually stitch DNA together, that
Okay, would
helix
it
of-
be a more accurate statement to say that it influences gene expression?
It influences gene expression.
Okay,
Yes,
that
because
that
when
I
you
understand. Foods
not
as
modifying the
signaling
DNA,
molecules.
but you're essentially having the same effect if you're keeping either the DNA replicatory cycle or the DNA transcription cycle, its ability to send messages. If you're interrupting that, then you are interrupting the message from the DNA. You're modifying the genome, because you're modifying the message from the genome. So it's not just the rungs of the ladder, but how those unzip and zip, these CGG sequences, for example, the cytosine, glycine sequences, the synthetic sequences, for example, some of the people that are pro-lab leak theory in COVID said, hey, there are sequences stitching these things together that do not occur naturally in nature. There's no mechanism in the human body for a cytosine, glycine sequence to stitch two strands of DNA together, so it must be synthetic. So my point is that DNA unwinds and rewinds and also sends messages. If you are having an epigenetic influence on that, by interrupting that communication, you could theoretically be impacting the genome.
this stuff gets endlessly
I think
fascinating.
it's scary anytime that we start synthetically modifying DNA and then putting it into the body and saying, well, we don't know that it's not harmful, so we're just going to do it.
Stray away from the basics at your own peril.
Yeah,
That-
stray right from the basics and stop really just thinking that you're so sick and pathologic and diseased. I mean, you may just be nutrient deficient. Really.
Gary, this has been amazing. Where can people follow along with you?
They can follow me at Instagram or listen to the Ultimate Human podcast anywhere that they listen to their podcast, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, or they can go to theultimatehuman.com.
Utterly fascinating. Speaking of things that are fascinating, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this interview with Gary Brecka, be sure to check out this interview with Peter Attia.
The higher that level, the longer you're going to live. There's no finding in all of biology that is more predictive of a person's length of life than that specific number.